The Jedi. For thousands of years, they were the galaxy's guardians, keepers of peace and justice. 1,000 generations trained to feel everything, yet attached to nothing. Love, but never love too deeply. Save lives, but never build one of their own. For millennia, they walked that razor's edge between humanity and divinity, until the very thing that made them powerful became the thing that destroyed them. Drawing from canon, legends, and the wider Star Wars lore, this is the story of the Jedi who shaped the Order across its entire history, from the very beginning all the way to the end of its era. Rajivari. Most Star Wars fans have never heard it. It barely gets a mention in most lore discussions, and yet this man, this one Jedi Master, wrote a set of principles that haunted the Order for the rest of its existence. He was the first to look at the institution and say, "This is wrong, and I'm going to tear it down." So let's go back 36,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. 8 enormous pyramid-shaped ships, we're talking structures so massive they defy easy explanation, are drifting through the stars. Nobody built them, as far as anyone can tell. Nobody programmed them. They appeared, and they started landing on worlds that were unusually strong in the Force. Force-sensitive beings felt something pull at them, an instinct they couldn't name, impossible to ignore. Wookiees, Twi'leks, Miraluka, humans, even members of the Sith species, all of them boarding these ships called the Thoyor. With no idea where they were going, they all converged on one planet, Tython, deep in the galactic core, and the moment those passengers stepped off the ships, they felt it. This planet was like the Force itself had a home address. But Tython came with conditions. If you were in balance, truly in balance, the Force flowing through you in harmony with both its light and dark currents, the planet was breathtaking, practically paradise. But if you tipped too far in either direction, Tython punished you. Storms, earthquakes, geological violence that tracked directly to your spiritual state. The land itself reacting to imbalance like a fever, burning off an infection. So the people who gathered there, the ancestors of what would eventually become the Jedi Order, learned the rules of survival fast. They called themselves the Jedi. And for them, balance wasn't an aspiration or a nice philosophical idea. It was the only way to stay alive on the ground they were standing on. The Force had two expressions, Ashla, the light, and Bogan, the dark, named after Tython's two moons. One bathed in pure light, and one permanently wrapped in shadow. Lean too hard toward either, and the Order exiled you to the corresponding moon until you found your center again. They said the dark side was half of everything, and pretending otherwise was dangerous. This is what Rajivari was born into. This was his world. Over roughly 10,000 years, the Jedi built 9 great temples, each anchored to one of the Thoyor ships, each dedicated to a different discipline. They developed a full ranking system. They trained generations of Force users. They had genuine civilization. And then the galaxy reminded them that civilization has enemies. The Despot War. A queen named Hadia launched a full-scale military campaign to conquer the entire Tython system. The Jedi had never faced anything like it. They were scholars, explorers, warriors in the individual sense, but not an organized military force. When Hadia's armies hit, they hit hard. The Order scrambled to respond, and in that chaos, Rajivari stepped up. He reorganized the Order into a fighting force, took command, and pushed back. The war cost over 100,000 lives before it was over. It was the bloodiest thing their civilization had ever experienced. And Rajivari was the man standing in the middle of it, making the hard calls, holding the line. When the war ended, he laid down his weapon and went to live alone on an island near one of the temples. He needed to sit with what war actually meant. And what it told him, after all that sitting, was that the Jedi were too passive, that the galaxy was full of bad people, people willing to use violence as a tool, and an Order devoted to spiritual balance was always going to be caught flat-footed by people who weren't. That the Force was power, real and enormous, and the wisest thing the Jedi could do was stop pretending it was something other than that, and start using it to govern, to prevent the next Hadia before she ever raised an army. He wrote all of this down. The Principles of Rajivari, a complete philosophical framework for what he believed the Order should be. Most of these principles were later destroyed, only the 2nd, 5th and 7th survived, and the ones that survived are worth reading slowly. The second principle, all life is a battle, even to the last breath. The 5th, mercy creates a spiral of destruction. The 7th, to sacrifice strength is the act of a fool. Read those 3, and you understand exactly why the Council rejected him. But if you've spent 5 minutes looking at how the galaxy actually operates, you can also see the man's logic. He was writing the worldview of someone who had held 100,000 dead in his accounting and decided idealism was a luxury the galaxy couldn't afford. The Force Wars complicated everything further. After the Rakata, a galaxy-spanning empire that used enslaved Force sensitives as weapons, invaded Tython, the Jedi built blades of focused Force energy to fight back. Using those blades required channeling the dark side. And channeling the dark side did what Tython had always warned it would do. It pulled people out of balance. When the Rakata were defeated, the Jedi were fractured. The Lightsiders and Darksiders couldn't coexist anymore, and the planet's own nature forced a choice. The Lightsiders declared themselves the Jedi Order, built a high council on Tython, wrote a creed, and said, "The dark side is off limits, entirely and forever." Rajivari sat on that first high council. He helped write that creed, and then he made his move. He wasn't secretly plotting all along. That's the important thing to understand about him. He believed in the order he'd helped found, but once it formally committed to rejecting half of the Force, once it chose peacekeeping over governing and contemplation over power, he concluded that what they were building would eventually be destroyed by its own principles. So he gathered his followers, and because he was Rajivari, because he was immeasurably powerful and extraordinarily charismatic, there were many. And he seized the ancient Temple of Knowledge at Calith. He raised his internal army. He declared his principles openly. He tried to tear down what he'd built so it could be rebuilt better. The council besieged Calith. Every single one of Rajivari's followers died in the fighting. Every one of them. He also died, became a Force ghost, and then built a time bomb, the Fount of Rajivari, his secret archive, hidden in an ancient acropolis beneath the ruins of a Tythonian city, protected by traps that could only be survived by someone who understood his principles, wasn't designed to destroy the Jedi. He left instructions in a spirit message. He wanted the Order torn down and rebuilt better, not permanently destroyed. He was daring future Jedi to actually grapple with what he believed, and he made clear to the Force ghost version of himself that waited there for thousands of years, that someone who just wanted destruction without rebuilding wasn't a worthy successor. They were just chaos. When a young Jedi Padawan eventually found the Fount, thousands of years later, during the era of the Old Republic, Rajivari's spirit directed them to stop a man named Nalan Raloch, a Twi'lek who had absorbed Rajivari's knowledge and used it purely for destruction, with no interest in the rebuilding part. Rajivari, the first Jedi to fall to the dark side, spent his afterlife protecting the Order from someone who wanted to use his legacy as a weapon. If someone tells you something terrible is coming, something specific, something detailed, something that sounds insane on the surface, and you dismiss them, exile them, call them crazy, and then that exact terrible thing arrives right on schedule, what do you owe that person? The Order had a very clear answer to that question, and the answer was, recall them from exile, hand them a command, and pretend the last 7 years didn't happen. That's the Daegen lock story in one sentence, but the full version is considerably more complicated and considerably more haunting. Let's go back to 25,805 BBY. The Despot War has just started. We talked about Rajivari's role in that war, but there's another name in that conflict that matters enormously here, Daegen Locke. Locke went undercover. He infiltrated Hadia's entire operation, became one of her generals, earned her trust completely, and in the process, became her lover. He was living a double life inside the enemy's command structure for the duration of the war, and when the moment came, he killed her himself. One operative, working from the inside, ended a system-wide conflict that had already cost 100,000 lives. When the smoke cleared, the council promoted him to master. 30 years old, roughly, and already a legend. Around 25,800 BBY, Locke is at the height of his career. Respected, powerful, a freshly minted Jedi Master. And he decides to go into the chasm. The chasm was a deep planetary rift beneath Anil-Kesh, the Temple of Science. Nobody fully understood what it was. Sensors couldn't penetrate its depths. Every droid sent down to chart it never came back. The standing rule was simple. Jedi don't go in there. The place drove people insane. Locke, being Locke, heard that and thought it sounded interesting. He convinced his friend, a Twi'lek named Hawk Rio, to go in with him, and together they descended into the chasm. What they found at the bottom, or what found them, was a force vision so overwhelming that it essentially rewrote both of them on the spot. They saw an army of dark warriors, carrying blades of frozen fire, marching across a world called Skywalker. Leading them, a figure with a single red eye. In the vision, Locke saw himself standing against them, leading people in the battle that would determine everything. The vision drove Locke into the dark side of the Force. The imbalance was so sudden and so severe that Tython itself reacted, and the Council had Locke brought before them immediately. He told them everything he'd seen, every detail, and the Council's response was to tell him he'd gone mad in the chasm, that the vision was the rift's influence on his mind, rather than a genuine Force foresight, and to exile him to Bogan, the Dark Moon, until he renounced his vision and returned to balance. Hawk Rio, who had seen the exact same thing, did what the Council asked. He told himself it was a hallucination. He said the right words, showed the right contrition, and was allowed to leave Bogan. He spent the next several years successfully convincing himself it had never happened. Locke refused. He sat on Bogan for 7 years, and held his ground. He carved the vision into the walls of his exile. He maintained it obsessively, feeding his connection to the dark side in the process, growing more consumed and erratic as the isolation compounded on top of the chasm's damage. His exact words about the Council, years later, were that they wanted him to tell them the lie they wished to hear, and he would not. What the chasm actually was, which the Jedi discovered much later, at its very bottom sat a prime infinity gate, an ancient portal technology left behind by a species called the Qua. The Qua had placed the chasm's madness-inducing properties there deliberately, as a security measure to keep anyone from reaching that gate. The Force vision Locke received was the gate showing him what was coming, a Force-driven warning about the Rakatan Infinite Empire, which had been searching for exactly that gate, whose fleet was at that very moment moving toward the Tython system. The army with blades of frozen fire, Force sabers, the Force hounds, the figure with one red eye, the Rakatan commander who would lead the invasion. Locke had seen the whole thing in precise detail, and the Council had called it psychosis. In 25,793 BBY, a ship crashed on Tython. One survivor, a young man named Xesh, a Force hound of the Rakata, the first outsider to reach the planet in living memory. And on Bogan, alone in his exile, Locke received another vision, this time of Xesh himself, the Dark Warrior, the one who carried a blade of fire. Locke immediately understood what Xesh was. The Council exiled Xesh to Bogan to find his balance, and Locke was right there waiting for him. He attacked Xesh first, tested him, measured him, then showed him the carvings on the walls, told him the vision, and when Xesh recognized the Force saber in those carvings as the weapon he himself carried, the two made a deal. Locke would get them off Bogan. Xesh would help him build more Force sabers, and together they would prove the vision to the Council by being ready when the army arrived. The next part of Locke's story is where his heroism and his breakdown become impossible to fully separate. He and Xesh escaped Bogan in a hidden starfighter, flew to the Crystal World to gather the materials they needed, built the first Force sabers on the factory world of Nox, and then tried to raise an army, first approaching survivors from the Despot War, then attempting to recruit from Hadia's old network. The Jedi pursued them the entire time. Locke used the Force to manipulate Jedi who tried to stop them. He was fully in the dark side at this point, and his methods showed it. He wasn't wrong about the threat. He was becoming dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with the Rakata. The Jedi eventually caught them. Xesh was talked down from the edge by Shakoda. Their bond had grown into something real and complicated during all of this, and Locke, separated from his only real ally, was overpowered and re-imprisoned, sent back to Bogan. And then the Rakata arrived. The Infinite Empire's fleet hit the Tython system like a hammer. The Jedi, completely unprepared for a war of this scale, scrambled everything they had. They built their own Force sabers in emergency forges, which immediately began pulling their wielders toward the dark side, as we said earlier, because that's what Force sabers do. And the Council, out of options and running out of time, recalled Daegen Locke from Bogan and gave him a military command. The man they'd imprisoned for 7 years, dismissed as insane, re-imprisoned a second time, was handed the army he'd always said the Order needed. He'd seen this exact scenario in the vision. He'd been punished for seeing it. Now he was the one being asked to respond to it. Locke fought. He led. Whatever the chasm and the isolation and the dark side had done to him, he was still the operative who'd infiltrated an enemy army as a young man. He understood war from the inside out. The allied forces of the Tython system settled worlds, and eventually Xesh himself managed to push the Rakata back. The Thoyor ships, whose true nature as weapons had never been fully understood, fired on the Rakatan fleet and destroyed the Prime Gate. Predor Skalnas, the Rakatan commander, was killed by Xesh. The invasion collapsed. After the battle, Daegen Locke told the council that he and his followers intended to keep using Force sabers regardless of the ruling, because there were still flesh raiders loose in the wilderness and the system remained dangerous. The council threatened to send him back to Bogan again. His answer: he would never go back there. He was done being confined for being right. What happened to Locke after that is part of what makes his story so tragic. What followed was the Force Wars, and it consumed everyone. Locke, already deep in the Bogan, was inevitably on one side of that split. The man who had warned the Order, sacrificed his sanity for the warning, been vindicated completely, and fought to protect the people who'd imprisoned him. He ended up on the wrong side of the line the Jedi drew when they built their new Order from the wreckage. 24,500 BBY, the Order is now about 1,000 years old, give or take. It's moved its main operations to Ossus, a lush, heavily forested world in the Outer Rim that would become the Jedi's spiritual home and the greatest center of knowledge in the galaxy for the next several millennia. The Order has structure, tradition, a proper council. It has survived its own founding crisis, survived Rajivari, survived the Force Wars. By any reasonable measure, it has stabilized. And then a Jedi Knight named Xendor raises his hand in a council meeting and asks a simple question. Can we open an academy to study Force traditions the Order currently forbids? The council says no, and the galaxy changes. Xendor is often framed as a power-hungry rebel who wanted to use the dark side because the dark side is stronger, faster, more seductive, whatever. That's not really him. Xendor was an exile from the Kashimir dynasty, one of the earliest known civilizations to develop a real understanding of the Force long before the Jedi landed on Tython. He came to the Jedi Order already carrying a philosophical tradition about the Force that predated the Order itself. He wasn't a student who got seduced by forbidden knowledge. He was a man who arrived with different knowledge and spent years watching the Order treat it as heresy. His argument was this: the Force is vast, and the Jedi study only a fraction of it, and an institution that refuses to look at parts of reality doesn't understand reality. It just controls the information its members are allowed to access. He went to the council with what he believed was a reasonable request: to open an academy, separate, voluntary, where Jedi who wanted to explore broader Force traditions could do so in a controlled, scholarly environment. He framed it as research, as expanding the Order's understanding of the thing it had dedicated itself to. Denied, completely and without serious discussion. He and his partner Arden Lyn departed Ossus and established their academy on the world of Leto. And the thing that tells you everything about the frustration bubbling under the surface of the Order at that moment. They weren't alone for long. At first it was ones and twos, a Jedi who'd always felt constrained by the Council's restrictions, a knight who'd had a question dismissed one too many times, a master who thought the Order's approach to the Force had grown too rigid. Then it was dozens, then hundreds. Xendor's legions of Leto grew faster than anyone expected, which itself should have told the Council something about how many of their members had been quietly asking the same questions Xendor asked out loud. The Jedi declared war, and Xendor, who claimed he never wanted it to come to this, decided that if it was going to be war, then he'd fight it on his terms. He took the battle directly to Ossus in a preemptive strike, trying to end it fast before it spread. The logic was sound. A prolonged conflict would drag the Republic into it, cost far more lives, destabilize everything, hit the head, kill the snake. The attack on Ossus failed, and once it failed, the war became exactly the prolonged mess Xendor had tried to prevent. Campaigns raged across Chandrila, Brental IV, Metellos, Coruscant itself. The legions of Leto fought across multiple fronts simultaneously, and Xendor, showing genuine strategic intelligence, tried a second approach alongside the military one. He went to the Republic directly, told them the Jedi were positioning themselves as protectors while secretly accumulating enough power and influence to govern unchecked, that the Order was becoming exactly the kind of quiet authority that healthy republics are supposed to guard against. The Republic didn't buy it, branded him a warlord, and sided with the Jedi, which honestly tracks. The Jedi had better PR and Xendor was in the middle of actively attacking planets, so the optics weren't great for his argument about being the reasonable one. The war's decisive moment came at the Battle of Columbus. Grandmaster Aldrista Pina, known throughout the Order by his nickname, the Green Blade, cornered Xendor there. Pina used a force battle meld, linking his Jedi together into a coordinated tactical unit that separated Xendor's vanguard from the rest of his army. Isolated, outmaneuvered, Xendor fought and was killed in single combat. Arden Lyn, who had been fighting alongside him for the entire war, survived and took command of what was left. What was left wasn't much. After Columbus, Pina pressed the advantage immediately. His forces marched on Leto itself, intent on finishing the legions entirely. Lyn made a practical decision: hold the line on Leto long enough for as many surviving legionnaires as possible to escape beyond Republic space, then run. She bought time, people got out, and she fled into unknown regions with the Jedi in pursuit. Pina eventually caught her on a world called Irkala. The two of them fought, a Jedi Grand Master and the last leader of the legions of Leto, alone on some forgotten world at the edge of the galaxy. Lyn was disarmed. Backed into a corner with nothing left, she channeled everything she had: grief, rage, love for Xendor, fury at what she believed had been stolen from them, through a Kashimir talisman she carried, a relic of Xendor's dynasty, an artifact of immense force power. It destroyed Pina's blade and mortally wounded him. But in his dying moments, Pina used a rare and extraordinary force technique called Moritro, the ability to slow another person's bodily functions, and stopped Arden Lyn's heart. Not killed her outright, stopped her heart just enough to put her into a deep, force-induced stasis. A hibernation so profound that her body simply paused, preserved, waiting. That stasis lasted 24,500 years. She woke up in 4 BBY during the height of the Galactic Empire. Imperial Inquisitors found her, revived her, and brought her to Palpatine, who converted her into one of his Emperor's hands. Dark side agents, who operated outside normal Imperial structure. He promised her he would summon Xendor's spirit back from the cosmic force. She believed him, because she'd spent 24,500 years unconscious, and had just woken up to find the galaxy unrecognizable, and Palpatine was offering her the one thing she actually wanted. Eventually she realized he had no intention of keeping that promise. Tried to defect during a coup against him. Failed. Spent years hunting the Kashimir talisman to resurrect Xendor herself, and was ultimately killed by Palpatine after the Battle of Endor. The surviving legionnaires who escaped Leto scattered beyond Republic space, and their philosophical tradition didn't die with them. It fragmented, evolved, passed from teacher to student in the dark spaces between stars. The line between Xendor's movement and Ajunta Pall's Dark Jedi, a full 17,500 years later, is debated by lore scholars, but the through line is there. Xendor is sometimes given the honorary title of the first Dark Lord of the Sith in certain records, because he was the first to carry the philosophical DNA that would eventually become them. More importantly, for this series, the first Great Schism established the template, a gifted Jedi with a legitimate grievance, an institution too rigid to absorb dissent without treating it as threat, a conflict that could have been a conversation but became a war. Every story has a point of no return, a moment where the thing that's coming becomes inevitable because of one specific decision made by one specific person that changes the direction of everything that follows. For the Jedi Order, for the Sith, for the entire galaxy's next 25,000 years of conflict, that moment belongs to Ajunta Pall, 7,000 BBY. The Order is no longer the young, fragile institution Rajivari tried to tear apart. It's ancient, established, trusted, and Ajunta Pall is one of its finest. A Jedi Master of extraordinary ability, Darth Trier, one of the most powerful Sith to ever live, would say thousands of years after his death that compared to Pall's mastery, her own combat skills were like a child playing with toys. That's the ceiling we're dealing with. His obsession was Sith alchemy. This was the ability to reshape life itself through the Force, to alter living creatures at a biological level, to change what something fundamentally was. Pall had discovered that with sufficient dark side power, the Force could bend the boundaries of life and death, could modify organisms, create new ones, do things that the conventional Jedi understanding of the Force said flatly weren't possible. He brought it to the Council, showed them what he'd found, and the Council looked at it and called it an abomination. Forbade him from continuing. End of discussion. Xendor wanted academic freedom, permission to study broadly, to run a school, to explore without restriction. Pall wasn't asking for a classroom. He was asking for permission to continue research that was already producing results he found profound. His argument was more personal. I have found something real and extraordinary, and you are telling me to pretend I didn't find it. He declared war immediately. And from the first battle, it was clear that this was not going to be a prolonged philosophical disagreement. The Dark Jedi under Pall, because others followed him too, drawn by what he'd found and what he represented, began creating monsters, creatures engineered through Sith alchemy and unleashed on battlefields. Shamblers, howlers, pit horrors, and worst of all, leviathans, massive beasts capable of absorbing the life essence of anything they touched, draining Force sensitives and leaving husks. The Jedi had never faced anything like them. The war became known as the 100-Year Darkness. 100 years of war across the galaxy, world after world. The Jedi fighting creatures that hadn't existed before Pall's research gave someone the tools to build them. At Korbos, it ended. The Jedi won. Pall himself killed over a dozen Jedi Masters in the final battle alone, over a dozen in one engagement, and still lost. His forces were overwhelmed, his army broken. The survivors were brought before the Order, stripped of everything, and exiled beyond Republic space with no ships capable of returning. Cast out into the dark and told to die out there quietly. They didn't die. They wandered, planet to planet, looking for somewhere habitable. 11 survivors of a century of war, carrying nothing but their abilities and the knowledge Pall had accumulated. And then one of them, a woman named Sorza Sin, remembered a rumor. A planet called Korriban, an indigenous species, humanoid, Force-sensitive, primitive by Jedi standards, but extraordinarily creative in their understanding of the Force. A species that called themselves the Sith. When the exiles landed on Korriban, King Hakagram Grouch came out to meet them. He saw their technology, felt their power, and made the reasonable calculation that welcoming them was safer than fighting them. He was not wrong about the power, he was wrong about the welcome. Grouch's own shadow hand, his second in command, had already been turned by the arriving Dark Jedi. The betrayal was coordinated before the landing was finished, and Ajunta Pall personally executed Hakagram Grouch with the king's own sword, beheading him in front of the assembled Sith, demonstrating in the most visceral possible terms that the old order was over. He used the Sith's own religious mythology against them. The Kisai, the Sith priest caste, had prophecies about beings of enormous power arriving from the stars, essentially a messiah tradition baked into their culture. Pall let them believe he was the fulfillment of those prophecies. He became Typhogem in their eyes, the left-handed god, a figure from their deepest religious traditions. The exiles were worshipped, and Pall, building on that worship and on the Sith's own native knowledge of the Force, used his Drain Knowledge ability, a dark side technique that pulled information directly out of minds, violently and without consent, to absorb the entire accumulated Force tradition of the Sith species into himself. Thousands of years of their knowledge, taken in one extended act of intellectual conquest. The first Sith Empire was born. Pall declared himself Genari, Dark Lord, and the other exiles became Sith Lords under him. They expanded from Korriban to Zeost, which became the Empire's capital, and then outward from there. Pall ruled for decades, building an empire that would torment the galaxy for the next several thousand years through his successors, and then he died and was buried in the Valley of the Dark Lords on Korriban, a tomb at the center of the valley, separate from the line of native Sith kings, because even in death the distinction mattered. His spirit stayed in that tomb for approximately 3,000 years. When Revan, we'll get to him in detail later, infiltrated Korriban in disguise, hunting a star map hidden in those tombs, he found Ajunta Pall's ghost waiting in the dark. What Revan encountered was not a proud Sith Lord radiating power and contempt. It was a broken old man who had forgotten his own name. The spirit greeted him with this: "I had a name once. I was one of many. We were servants of the dark side. Sith Lords we called ourselves. So proud. In the end we were not so proud. We hid from those we had betrayed. We fell, and I knew it would be so." 3,000 years in a tomb on a dead world, and the thing weighing on him was shame. He told Revan about the Sith's internal wars, how they had nearly destroyed themselves through infighting and betrayal, how the empire he built had cannibalized itself repeatedly across the centuries. He described it as remorse, watching what you built tear itself apart and knowing you gave it the tools to do exactly that. Revan talked him down, removed his blade, the alchemical Sith sword Pall had carried through the 100-year darkness, and convinced him that the darkness he'd served had already shown its nature in full. Pall, in his last moments of coherent existence, told Revan not to keep the sword, said it was the blade that killed him, not in battle, in the sense that it represented the choice that had cost him everything. He let go of it, and the shame with it, and became one with the Force, the first Dark Lord of the Sith, redeemed in a tomb on the planet he'd conquered, 3 millennia after the decisions that defined him. By the time Revan found him, the only thing left was the letting go. The Force ghost of the man who started the Sith finally admitted, after everything, that the Council hadn't been entirely wrong about what his research would produce. Not wrong about the knowledge, wrong about the application, about what he would do with it when cornered and furious and proud. Pall's ability, Sith alchemy, the reshaping of life, becomes the foundational technology of the Sith Empire. The Leviathans he built get used for generations. His sword sits in his tomb for 3,000 years, and multiple Sith Lords make pilgrimages to look at it. The knowledge he drained from the Sith species gets passed down, modified, expanded into holocrons and traditions and techniques that Revan will find, that Exar Kun will find, that Palpatine will eventually inherit the downstream of. One man's forbidden research project became the engine of 25,000 years of war. And at the end of it, in a dark tomb, the man who started it was embarrassed about the whole thing. That might be the most Star Wars sentence ever written. There's a particular kind of person who shows up in every institution, in every era, in every corner of human history. They're not the strongest, not the most decorated, or the ones who win battles. They're the ones who remember, who write things down, preserve what others discard, and quietly outlast everyone who ever underestimated them. In the Jedi Order, across nearly 9 centuries of existence, that person was Odan-Urr. He was a Draethos, a species with natural, telepathic abilities and a lifespan that makes humans look like mayflies. He was trained on Ossus by a Salesian Jedi Master named Uru, who floated around in a tank of cyanogen gas because his species breathed it instead of air. Even by Jedi standards, the optics were unusual, and Odan-Urr himself was physically unimpressive, small, frail completely, without the combat instincts the Order typically prized. His fellow Padawans could outfight him easily. His master spent years redirecting his energy away from lightsaber training and toward the thing Odan-Urr was actually built for, seeing. Seeing, as in knowing what was coming before it arrived. 5,000 BBY. Odan-Urr is serving as watchman of the Koros system, essentially the Jedi's local representative, keeping an eye on things, handling disputes, being present. He has a vision, a nightmare, really. He sees Marka Ragnos dying on Korriban, and he understands immediately what that means. Marka Ragnos was the Dark Lord of the Sith, and his death would trigger a succession war. That succession war would produce a winner hungry for conquest. That winner would have a fleet, and that fleet would come for the Republic. He took this vision to Empress Teta of the Koros system, a ruler who actually listened, and together they went to the Galactic Senate on Coruscant, stood before the assembled representatives of the Republic, and said, "The Sith are coming, prepare." The Senate laughed them out of the chamber, literally dismissed them as alarmists, inexperienced, overreacting to a bad dream. The Republic had enjoyed nearly 1,000 years of peace, since Ajunta Pall's empire had collapsed in on itself. The idea of a Sith invasion felt like mythology dressed up as intelligence. Nobody wanted to spend money preparing for a war that might be a hallucination. Empress Teta believed him anyway. She mobilized her own forces independently, and when Naga Sado's Sith fleet hit the Republic, Teta's armies were the ones who were ready. Odan-Urr fought at the Battle of Kirik alongside his master Uru, and Uru died there, cracking open his gas canister and releasing the cyanogen he breathed as a weapon against the Massassi warriors, sacrificing himself to turn the tide. His last words to Odan-Urr were essentially, "You know what you're supposed to do. Go do it." After the Great Hyperspace War ended, with the Sith fleet broken and Naga Sado in exile, Odan-Urr went through the wreckage of Sado's warship and found a Sith holocron, the only one known to exist at the time. He took it, kept it, studied it, carefully, from a safe distance for the next 1,000 years. Every other Jedi who knew about it said it should be destroyed. Odan-Urr's argument was simple. You cannot understand your enemy by erasing their knowledge. You understand them by keeping it where you can see it. He was the keeper of antiquities. Keeping dangerous things safely was literally his job. He founded the Great Jedi Library on Ossus shortly after the war. This was his master's dying wish made real, a center of Jedi learning on the world where Uru had trained him, containing every document, scroll, holocron and artifact the Order had ever produced. 4 towers, each organized by era, a categorization system Odan-Urr invented himself. Hundreds of Jedi trained there over the centuries. He presided over the whole thing for nearly a millennium, adding to it constantly, never satisfied that it was complete, because it never was. He also, almost as a side project, rewrote the Jedi Code. The version that existed before his revision was widely considered frustratingly abstract. Jedi Padawans across the Order struggled to understand what it actually meant in practice. Odan-Urr went through it line by line and clarified it into the version that every Jedi from that point forward would memorize and recite. There is no emotion, there is peace. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. That version, his version, lasted until Order 66, when the last Jedi who knew it by heart were killed or scattered. Nearly 4,000 years of the Order's spiritual foundation, written by a man who was told as a Padawan that he wasn't a very good fighter. He trained Jedi throughout all of it. Nomi Sunrider, who we'll get to shortly, came to him for guidance during the years before the Great Sith War. He told her about the Force techniques she didn't know she was capable of, including the ability to sever another being's connection to the Force entirely, permanently. He'd used it himself after the Great Hyperspace War, cutting off captured Sith from the dark side as a more lasting punishment than imprisonment. He described it to Nomi matter-of-factly, the way a craftsman describes a specialized tool. He'd had 9 centuries to make peace with the harder parts of his own history. By 3996 BBY, Odan-Urr was ancient even by Drythos standards. He presided over the conclave at Deneba, an emergency gathering of the Jedi Order to address the rising threat of the Krath, a dark side cult that had already begun attacking Jedi. The conclave was ambushed. Assassination droids hidden in supply containers opened fire on the assembled masters. Odan-Urr survived, barely, and the attack confirmed what he'd been quietly observing for years. Something much larger than the Krath was organizing behind the scenes. He was right. Exar Kun was already on Ossus when Odan-Urr returned. Kun had come to recruit, standing among the young Jedi in the library, performing, selling them on a vision of forbidden knowledge and the Order's supposed failures, already having fallen completely to the dark side without anyone realizing it. And Kun overheard Odan-Urr speaking privately about the Sith holocron, the only one in existence. 1,000 years of Sith knowledge stored in a single artifact, held by a 900-year-old Jedi who understood exactly what it contained. Kun forced his way into Odan-Urr's private chambers, demanded the holocron. When the ancient Jedi refused, Kun brutally slew him and took the artifact, and Odan-Urr died surrounded by the books he loved so much, just as his own teacher, Master Uru, had predicted. Then Kun walked back out to the young Jedi he'd been recruiting, told them Odan-Urr had just passed away peacefully from old age, and that in his final moments the old master had declared Kun a Jedi Master and entrusted him with the holocron personally. They believed him. Why wouldn't they? He was confident, powerful, and Odan-Urr was 900 years old. It was plausible, and Kun had the holocron in his hand as proof. He then used that same holocron on Yavin 4 to possess his new recruits with ancient Sith spirits, completing their conversion to the dark side. The object Odan-Urr had spent 1,000 years guarding became the weapon that corrupted the generation he'd spent centuries training. Exar Kun, trained on Dantooine under a Krevaki Jedi Master named Vodosyosk Bas, a brilliant teacher, patient, deeply wise, someone who saw potential in his most difficult student and kept investing in him anyway. Kun was the best fighter in his class. He defeated his fellow Padawans in duels without much effort, including a Cathar student named Silver, who gave him the 3 scars across his face that he'd carry for the rest of his life. He was talented, driven, and completely unwilling to accept any ceiling on what he was allowed to know. That last quality is the one that defined everything. When Bas caught him studying forbidden Sith history through a holocron he wasn't supposed to have, the reprimand landed wrong. The Sith had built civilizations, developed techniques, accumulated knowledge over thousands of years, and the Jedi's response was to pretend none of it was worth examining. He found that intellectually insulting, and when Bas couldn't give him a satisfying answer, beyond essentially because we said so, Kun decided the conversation was over. He abandoned his master and left Dantooine without permission or ceremony. Followed a trail of references and rumours to Onderon, a world with deep Sith history. The former domain of Freedon Nad, a Jedi who had turned Sith, studied under Naga Sadow himself on Yavin 4 and ruled Onderon as a Dark King for decades before his death. Kun wanted Nad's artifacts. The Jedi stationed on Onderon refused him access and started asking pointed questions about why a Padawan was so interested in a dead Sith Lord's belongings. Kun didn't argue. He found 2 local Nadist cultists in the streets of Iziz, convinced them to take him to Nad's tomb on the jungle moon Zun, and broke in himself. Inside the tomb, Nad's spirit was waiting, and this is the moment people misread most often in Exar Kun's story. Nad didn't seduce him. Kun wasn't a naive young Jedi who got sweet-talked into darkness by a clever ghost. Nad tested him, manipulated him, eventually crushed his body under a cave-in and told him the dark side was the only way out. Kun resisted for as long as he could, genuinely resisted, searching for any light side solution to the rock pinning his bones. When none existed, he called on the dark side out of pure refusal to die. He felt the difference immediately. The dark felt like a door opening, like the Force finally at full volume, instead of the filtered, managed version the Jedi had given him access to. He emerged from that cave-in changed, and here's the honest part of it, relieved. Whatever the Jedi had been protecting him from, it hadn't felt dangerous. It had felt like power. Nad directed him to Korriban, to the Valley of the Dark Lords, where ancient Sith spirits put him through further trials. He passed them all. Then Nad directed him to Yavin 4. And on Yavin 4, Kun did something that tells you exactly who he was at his core. He destroyed Nad's spirit the moment he didn't need it anymore. Nad had served his purpose as a guide and a key. Kun had what he came for. He turned the amulet Nad had given him against the spirit itself and erased it. The student eating the teacher the moment the lesson was done, it was the most Sith thing imaginable, and Kun did it completely naturally, like it was obvious. Then he enslaved the Massassi, the primitive warrior descendants of Naga Sadow's original followers, still living on Yavin 4 thousands of years after Sadow had retreated there, and put them to work building temples. Massive, architecturally sophisticated structures designed to focus and amplify dark side energy, each one a node in a network that turned the entire moon into a dark side battery. He created Sith spawn in Naga Sadow's old laboratories, Terran Tatex, battle hydras, the Night Beast, creatures engineered to be weapons the way Ajunta Pall had engineered them millennia before. He imprisoned the souls of the Massassi children inside an artifact called the Golden Globe, using their trapped life energy as additional fuel for his rituals. He built himself a kingdom from scratch in about a year, and then he got bored with it and decided to start a war. He needed an ally, someone with military connections, political access, and ideally an existing power base among the dark side factions, already operating in Republic space. He found exactly that in Ulic Qel-Droma, who by that point had already fallen to the dark side and was leading the Krath cult in the Empress Teta system. When the two of them met, the spirit of Marka Ragnos, the ancient Sith Dark Lord, whose death had triggered the Great Hyperspace War 4,000 years earlier, appeared before both of them simultaneously. Ragnos declared them the new Dark Lords of the Sith and established between them the first version of what would eventually become the Rule of Two, one to embody power, one to crave it. Kun was the master, Ulic was the apprentice. The Brotherhood of the Sith was born, and Kun immediately went to Ossus. He walked back into Jedi society, wearing the face of a visiting scholar, criticized the current order's rigidity to the assembled Padawans, demonstrated his power openly, and told them he'd been the one to destroy Freeden Nad's ghost, framing it as a heroic act rather than a convenient disposal. He won over 20 Jedi Knights and Padawans in a single conversation, turned them to the Sith right there in the library, on the planet that was the Order's sacred heart. Then he overheard Odan-Urr mention the Sith holocron. We already covered what happened next. He killed Odan-Urr, took the holocron, and lied to the young Jedi he'd just recruited about how the old master had died. The Great Sith War that followed was the closest the Jedi Order ever came to total annihilation before Order 66. Kun's forces hit simultaneously on multiple fronts, the Krath and Mandalorian allies creating chaos across Republic space, while his converted Jedi turned against their own masters. He had the corrupted Jedi assassinate their former teachers in coordinated strikes. He used Alima Keto to detonate the stars of the Kron cluster, a superweapon move that destroyed entire systems and scorched Ossus itself, ending the Great Jedi Library, ending everything Odan-Urr had spent centuries building in a single act. He fought his own master Vodo Siosk Bas in single combat, revealing for the first time the double-bladed lightsaber he'd modified from his original weapon. Bas, who had trained him, who knew every technique he'd ever learned, was killed by the extra blade he never anticipated. Then Ulic was captured, and that was the crack in everything. The Republic held a public trial. Kun broke in, froze every single person in the Senate chamber through the Force simultaneously, walked to where Ulic was being held, and freed him in front of the entire Republic government. The statement was clear: your institutions cannot hold what we've built. But Ulic's capture had already done its damage internally. The momentum shifted. The Republic and Jedi reorganized around the vulnerability Ulic's capture revealed, launched a coordinated counter-offensive, and pushed Kun's forces back across multiple systems. Kun retreated to Yavin 4. When the Jedi fleet arrived in orbit, he understood immediately that the physical battle was over. So he did the only thing that made sense to a man who had never once accepted the terms the universe tried to impose on him. He refused to die on anyone else's schedule. He gathered the Massassi into the Great Temple, drained their life energy, every soul on the moon, thousands of people, channeled it into a ritual that ripped his own consciousness free from his body and fused it into the stone of the temple complex. His body burned, his spirit didn't. He slept in those stones for 4,000 years. Luke Skywalker's Jedi Academy on Yavin 4 woke him up, a dozen Force sensitives living directly above his resting place, radiating exactly the kind of energy that could pull a sleeping spirit back into awareness. He spent months corrupting Luke's students one by one, working through a young man named Kip Durran, who he almost fully turned, nearly killing Luke in his sleep by draining his life force. The students of the new academy eventually banded together and drove him out, combined a light side energy overwhelming what was left of him after 4 millennia of disembodied existence. Nomi Sunrider never asked for any of this. Nomi was on a space station with her husband and her baby daughter, delivering a Daegen crystals to a Jedi Master on a backwater planet, thinking about completely ordinary things, when a Gorm worm came out of nowhere and killed her husband in seconds. A Gorm worm, a poisonous lizard thrown by a Hutt gang member who wanted the crystals. That's how it started. A robbery gone violent on a transit station, and Andur Sunrider dead on the floor before anyone understood what was happening. His Force ghost appeared to Nomi immediately and told her the one thing she absolutely did not want to hear. Pick up my lightsaber and defend yourself and Vima. She killed the attackers, and then she stood there with a dead husband, a crying infant, a lightsaber she'd never trained with, and a set of crystals she still needed to deliver to a Jedi Master she'd never met. She delivered them. She found Master Thon on Ambria, an ancient, enormously powerful Jedi who looked, frankly, like a large four-legged reptile and spoke very little, communicating mostly through presence and action rather than words. He agreed to train her, and Nomi's response was to say yes to the training and no to the lightsaber. She would learn the Force. She would not pick up that blade again. The last time she'd used it, she'd killed people over stolen crystals while her husband's body was still warm, and she had no interest in becoming someone for whom that was a normal Tuesday. Thon didn't argue with her. He trained her around the refusal, letting her develop her Force connection through everything except combat. Nomi had a natural gift for battle meditation, the ability to reach into the minds of everyone in a conflict simultaneously and shift the balance, coordinating allies, disrupting enemies, turning the psychological tide of entire battles from a single point of concentration. She could make enemy soldiers turn on each other. She could break Sith illusions that had fooled trained masters. She could hold a battle together through sheer clarity of Force connection, the way a conductor holds an orchestra, except the orchestra was an army, and the music was survival. She eventually picked the lightsaber back up. You can probably guess why. The galaxy didn't give her the option of staying unarmed indefinitely. She trained under Vodo Siosk Bas on Ossus, built her own blade, became a Jedi Knight properly. And it was through those missions, Onderon the Freeden Nad uprising, the early conflicts with the Krath, that she met Ulic Qel-Droma. He was warm, one of those people who made everyone around them feel capable and seen. His master Arkajeth had shaped him into a Jedi, who was both technically exceptional and emotionally present. He and his brother Kay were inseparable. He and Nomi, once they started working together on Onderon, were inevitable. The Order at that time didn't prohibit attachment the way the prequel-era Order would, and nobody pretended not to notice. Their masters were pleased. They were good together. Then Ulic volunteered for the worst mission of his life, with the best intentions imaginable. The Krath had seized control of the Empress Teta system, a dark side cult run by two Tetan nobles, Satel and Alima Keto, who'd gotten their hands on actual Sith magic and used it to take power. The Jedi and Republic had already tried a direct military assault and gotten devastated, losing multiple ships to Alima's Sith illusions. Ulic's proposal was simple in concept. Go in undercover, become one of them, learn the Krath from the inside, and destroy it from there. The Council was against it. Nomi was against it, specifically, because she'd watched the dark side work on people up close. She understood in her bones what Ulic was proposing to put himself inside. He went anyway. What nobody fully accounted for, what Ulic himself failed to account for, was that the dark side is patient in a way that human psychology simply isn't built to outlast. Satel Keto poisoned him early in his infiltration with a Sith chemical that made him hypersensitive to dark side energy, specifically to make him easier to corrupt. One compromise at a time, one rationalization at a time, the man Nomi loved started disappearing behind the man the Krath needed him to be. She came to find him on Sinaga, looked him in the face and asked him to come home. He ordered her captured, told her quietly while no one else could hear that he was still playing the role, still undercover, still in control. Then Satel overheard and ordered them both executed. Ulic killed Satel in front of everyone and declared himself High Priest of the Krath, and the question of whether it was still a performance stopped being answerable. Nomi escaped, Ulic stayed, and then Exar Kun arrived and offered him a partnership. The war consumed everything after that. Nomi fought on the Republic side. Her battle meditation became the Republic's most critical strategic asset, the thing that made the difference in engagement after engagement. She was watching a war being fought by a man she loved against everything she believed in, and she kept fighting anyway because there was no other option, and because stopping would have meant giving Exar Kun exactly what he wanted. The end came on Ossus during the chaos of the Kron Cluster's destruction. Ulic and Kay, brothers, who had been on opposite sides of the war, finally faced each other directly. Kay tried to reach him, said the things brothers say when one of them is disappearing. Come back, I'm still here, you're still in there somewhere. Ulic killed him, cut his own brother down, and stood over the body. And in that moment, by the accounts of everyone who witnessed it, something in his face changed. Nomi was there. She'd watched Kay die. She looked at the man she loved standing over his brother's body, and made a decision that no one in Jedi history had ever made in quite the same way, in quite the same circumstances. She severed Ulic from the Force, completely, permanently, reaching into the connection that defined him and cutting it clean, removing the dark side's hold by removing everything, the light with it. It was a technique Odan-Urr had described to her, something he'd used on captured Sith after the Great Hyperspace War. She turned it on a man she'd kissed goodbye when he left for the mission that destroyed him. Ulic surrendered immediately. Without the Force, the war had no meaning. He was left with nothing but clarity, and clarity showed him what he'd done. He led the Republic and the Jedi to Yavin 4, where the combined light side energy of hundreds of Jedi purged Exar Kun's spirit from the temples, ending the Great Sith War. Then he walked away into exile. Nomi didn't try to stop him. She became Grand Master. Of course she did. The Order had just been through its worst crisis in millennia, and the person who had held it together through battle meditation and sheer refusal to break was the obvious choice. She called the first Jedi Conclave in over a decade, stood before the surviving Knights and Masters, and found words for what came next. The galaxy was still there. The Order was still there. She was still there. Ulic died years later, shot in the back by a pilot named Hogan, who wanted to be famous for killing a war criminal. He died in Nomi's arms. He asked for forgiveness, and she told him she'd already given it, which was true, and which he needed to hear, and which cost her something to say out loud, in that moment that no rank or title makes easier. His body vanished as he died, becoming one with the Force, despite having been severed from it. Darth Revan. He was the kind of person other Jedi gravitationally orbited, charismatic, brilliant, impossible to ignore in a room. His closest friend was a man named Alec, who would later become Darth Malak. Together, they were the most formidable pair the Order had produced in a generation. Then the Mandalorians started attacking the Outer Rim. The Mandalorian Neo-Crusaders hit Republic worlds hard and fast. Cathar, Taris, dozens of outer systems, and the Jedi Council said, wait, investigate, don't rush in. Revan looked at that response, looked at what was happening to actual people on actual planets, while the Council investigated, and said no. He gathered every Jedi willing to follow him, hundreds of them, the Revanchists they were called, and led them into the war alongside the Republic military. Before he left, he found the Mandalorian mask of a warrior who had stood in front of an entire population on Cathar and pleaded for their lives before being killed alongside them. He put that mask on his face, wore it for the entire war, as a reminder of what the Council's patience had cost. He won. The Mandalorian Wars ended at Malachor V, where Revan defeated Mandalore the Ultimate in single combat, while one of his generals, Meetra Surik, activated the mass shadow generator and turned the planet into a graveyard. The Mandalorian fleet surrendered. The Republic celebrated. The Jedi Council ordered Revan and Malak to come home and answer for conducting a war without authorization. Revan didn't come home, not yet. In Mandalore, the Ultimate's final moments, he told Revan something that most commanders would have filed away and forgotten. The Mandalorians hadn't started the war on their own. Someone had manipulated them into it. Some hidden Sith influence, operating from the unknown regions, had pushed the Mandalorian clans toward the Republic like a weapon being aimed. Revan had just won a war that was someone else's opening move. He needed to know whose. He took a third of the Republic fleet, excused as pursuing Mandalorian stragglers, and disappeared into the unknown regions with Malak. What they found on the Sith world of Drummond Kaas was the thing nobody in the Republic or the Jedi Order knew existed, the Sith Emperor, an immortal Sith Lord who had survived Marka Ragnos' original empire, consolidated power in secret for thousands of years, and had been orchestrating galactic events from the shadows since before the Great Hyperspace War. Revan and Malak went there to kill him. Instead, Vitiate broke both their minds simultaneously. the most powerful dark side mental assault in history, and turned them into his advance agents, sent back to destabilize the Republic ahead of his planned full invasion. The conditioning held for a while. Revan and Malak returned to known space as Darth Revan and Darth Malak, declared themselves Sith Lords, launched the Jedi Civil War with the Starforge providing an essentially unlimited fleet. But Revan broke free of the Emperor's mental control. And when he did, what he chose to do with that freedom was not what you'd expect. He kept the war going, deliberately, because he'd calculated that a weakened, battle-hardened Republic was more likely to survive Vitiate's eventual full invasion than a soft, peaceful one. He was trying to forge the galaxy into something tough enough to resist what was coming. The Jedi Civil War was Revan's attempt to save the Republic by nearly destroying it first. Whether that logic holds up ethically is a separate discussion. The point is that even as Darth Revan, even running a Sith Empire, he was working from a plan nobody else knew existed. Then Malak betrayed him. A Jedi strike team led by Bastila Shan boarded his flagship, and Malak, seeing the opportunity, ordered his own ships to fire on Revan's bridge. His best friend, his apprentice, tried to kill him to take the throne. Bastila saved Revan's life instead of leaving him to die, and the Jedi took him to the Council, who did something that had never been done before and hasn't been done since. They wiped his mind completely, replaced his identity, gave him a new name, a new face in the records, and put him back in the field as a Republic soldier. A weapon aimed at the Empire he himself had built, guided by a force bond with Bastila that neither of them fully understood. He didn't know he was Revan. He fought alongside Bastila, recovered fragments of his own past life from star maps hidden across the galaxy, and slowly, through the force bond and through the echoes of who he'd been, began to remember. The moment the game reveals his identity, when Malak tells him the truth on the Starforge, is one of the most celebrated twists. If you've done terrible things as one person, and then become someone else entirely, and then choose to go back to confronting those terrible things, who are you in that moment? The man who did them? The man who forgot them? Or someone new built from both? He defeated Malak, destroyed the Starforge, the Republic won the Jedi Civil War, and then the memories kept coming back. The real ones. He lived with Bastila on Coruscant for 2 years, nightmares every night. The shape of something enormous and patient just beyond the edge of what he could see clearly. Eventually he told her he had to go back. He had to find Vitiate and finish what he and Malak had failed to do the first time. She let him go, because she understood by then that Revan was constitutionally incapable of leaving a threat unaddressed. He was captured. Vitiate imprisoned him on Natima, a planet so thoroughly drained of the Force by one of the Emperor's ancient rituals that it was a dead zone, completely cut off from the galaxy's Force signature, and held him in stasis for 300 years, 3 centuries, during which Revan, still conscious inside the stasis, spent every waking moment pushing back against Vitiate's mind through their direct connection. He couldn't break free, but he could influence the Emperor just enough, just subtly enough, to keep delaying the full invasion of the Republic. For 300 years, a man imprisoned in a Force-dead world bought the galaxy time by sheer refusal to let go. Meetra Surik eventually found him. They planned an assault on the Emperor together, alongside a Sith Lord named Scourge, who claimed to want the Emperor dead. Scourge betrayed them. He had a vision of a future hero defeating Vitiate and decided Revan wasn't that person, so he killed Meetra and returned Revan to stasis rather than risk the wrong outcome. Another 300 years passed, his final arc, leading the Order of Revan, trying to force the Emperor into a final confrontation at Yavin 4, being stopped by both Republic and Imperial forces who couldn't agree on whether he was a hero or a threat, ended with his 2 halves literally dividing. The light side of Revan that had always driven the plan, and the dark side that centuries of Vitiate's influence had cultivated, separated into 2 distinct presences. The light side helped defeat the dark. The 2 halves merged back together. Revan became whole, one last time, and then became one with the Force. Bastila Shan was 23 years old when she saved the galaxy the first time. Nobody called it that at the time. Officially, it was a capture mission, a Jedi strike team boarding a Sith Lord's flagship. But when Malak fired on his own master's bridge and Revan's mind shattered from the impact. It was Bastila who stayed, who knelt beside a broken Sith Lord in the middle of a burning warship and used the Force to hold his life together long enough to get him out. One impulsive act of mercy and the entire trajectory of the war changed. She was born on Tal Ravin, given to the Jedi Order as an infant by a mother who decided that a life of travel and instability wasn't suitable for her daughter. Helena Shan wanted her child to have stability, structure, a future. The Jedi seemed to offer all of those things. What they found in Bastila almost immediately was a gift so rare that most Jedi Masters went their entire careers without ever encountering it in a student: battle meditation. The ability to reach into a battle through the Force and reshape it. Entire fleets responded to it. Soldiers who had been retreating held their ground. Enemy formations collapsed from within. One Padawan, sitting perfectly still with her eyes closed, doing more strategic work than an entire command deck. The Jedi Civil War almost certainly gets lost without her. Malak's Sith fleet had numbers, the Starforge producing ships faster than the Republic could match them. Bastila's battle meditation was the counterweight that kept the Republic viable long enough to fight. Malak understood this completely. When he fired on Revan's bridge, his very next priority was finding her. Kill her or turn her. Those were the only two options that made strategic sense. He spent the opening year of the war hunting her specifically, while simultaneously running a galactic military campaign. That's how valuable she was. That's what she was carrying at 23 years old. She'd been told since childhood that her gift was extraordinary, that the fate of the Republic rested on her ability, that she was irreplaceable. That kind of weight, applied to a person from infancy, produces someone who compensates for the pressure by projecting absolute certainty. She held the Jedi Code tightly because the code was stable ground in a life that had never offered much of it. Every rule followed, every doctrine observed, every emotion held at arm's length. That was Bastila's version of keeping herself together, which is exactly why what Malak did to her worked. He captured her during the search for the Starforge, took her to Rakata Prime, and spent a week breaking her down systematically. He found every resentment she'd ever suppressed and pulled it into the light, the Council using her gift as a military asset without ever asking how she felt about being a weapon. The way the Order had taken her from her mother and called it salvation. The attachment she'd developed for Revan, the man she'd been assigned to monitor, who had turned out to be nothing like the monster she'd imagined, who had made her feel things she'd spent her whole life being trained not to feel. Malak took all of that buried material and told her, "The code you've been following is a cage, and the people who gave it to you benefit from keeping you in it." After a week she broke, a 23-year-old, alone, being tortured continuously by a Sith Lord who had specifically identified every psychological fault line she had. She wasn't weak, she was human, she had limits, and Malak found them. And the idea that a stronger Jedi wouldn't have broken under those conditions is the kind of thing people say when they've never been in a room where someone has decided to destroy them completely. She became his apprentice, used her battle meditation for the Sith, stood on the Temple of the Ancients, on Rakata Prime in dark robes, and tried to convince Revan, whose memories had come back by then, who knew who he was and what they were to each other, to come back to the dark side with her. Revan didn't fight her, he talked to her, which was the only thing that could have worked. On the Starforge, when she confronted him a second time and he defeated her in combat, she begged him to kill her, said she'd done too much, broken too completely, that death was the only proportionate response. He refused, told her the dark side had taken enough from both of them, the Force bond between them. The thing that had started as a strategic accident, as the Council's tool for guiding an amnesiac Sith Lord, had become the actual mechanism of her return. She used battle meditation one more time in that battle, turned it on the Sith fleet at the critical moment, flipped the engagement completely, gave the Republic the margin it needed. She came back to the light. She and Revan lived on Coruscant for 2 years. They had a son named Vanna. She watched Revan's nightmares get worse every month, watched him disappear into the thing he'd seen in the unknown regions, and eventually watched him leave to go finish it. She never saw him again in any meaningful sense. There's a moment at the Battle of Malachor 5 that nobody who was there ever fully recovered from. The fleet battle had been raging for hours. Republic ships and Mandalorian warships tearing each other apart in orbit above a planet that already hummed with dark side energy. Revan had lured the Mandalorians there, deliberately, to a world they considered taboo, knowing they couldn't resist the bait. And at the center of the Republic's position, overseeing the trap's final mechanism, stood Meetra Surik, Revan's top general, the person he trusted with the one decision that would end the war. She looked at Odan-Urr, the Zabrak engineer who had built the mass shadow generator on Revan's orders, and she nodded. Just a nod, and then everything happened at once. The mass shadow generator pulled the gravitational mass of Malachor itself into a vortex. Ships in orbit, Mandalorian and Republic alike, were dragged into it and crushed against the planet's crust. The surface was devastated simultaneously. Thousands of soldiers on the ground, including Republic troops who had been fighting down there, were killed in seconds. The planet fractured to its core, splitting into broken chunks held together only by the gravitational anomalies the weapon had created. The Force screamed. That's not a metaphor. Every Force sensitive in range felt it as a physical sensation. A psychic shockwave of mass death, so enormous it registered as a wound in the fabric of the Force itself, a hole where life had been. Meetra felt all of it, every single death, and her response, the involuntary, instinctive, completely human response of a person suddenly drowning in the deaths of thousands, was to let go. Not of the Force in some measured, meditative way. She severed herself from it completely, instantly, the way you pull your hand back from a flame. The connection simply closed, and in the silence that followed, she was deaf to something she had heard every moment of her life since childhood. She was the only Jedi present at Malachor who did that. Every other Jedi who survived either fell to the dark side from the psychic impact or fled, cut herself off, and walked back to a shuttle and flew to the Jedi Council and stood in front of them and said, "Here I am, judge me." The Council exiled her, and the specific reasoning they gave is the part that has bothered lore scholars ever since. Because they didn't exile her for Malachor, they exiled her for the severing. The act of cutting herself off from the Force was, in the Council's view, a greater crime than the thousands of deaths, because it demonstrated a complete break with the Force's will. She had chosen disconnection over pain, and that choice was what they couldn't forgive. She surrendered her lightsaber by driving it point first into the floor in front of them and walking out. For 10 years she was nobody, wandered the edges of Republic space, worked as a Republic soldier under a false identity, kept her head down and her Force connection locked away, and didn't think about any of it. Then Kreia found her. Kreia is her own story. A former Jedi Master who had become Darth Trier, been betrayed by her own Sith apprentices, lost her Force connection as a result, and emerged from that experience with a philosophy so deeply cynical about the Force itself that she genuinely believed the galaxy would be better off without it. She found Meetra on a space station called Perigus, unconscious, nearly dead. She restored Meetra's Force connection, which immediately started behaving strangely, in ways neither of them fully understood yet. Because Meetra wasn't just a Jedi who had severed herself from the Force, she was a wound in the Force. The death of thousands at Malachor hadn't just scarred her, it had restructured her fundamental relationship with the Force. Everyone she spent time with, she formed Force bonds with, involuntarily, drawing them closer to the Force, amplifying their connection, pulling their development forward in ways that normal proximity never would. Companions grew stronger around her. Broken people found their connection to the Force restored in her presence. She wasn't healing them consciously, she was just existing near them, and the wound in her was somehow healing the wounds in everyone else. The Sith Triumvirate had been hunting Jedi for a decade while she was in exile. Darth Nihilus, Darth Sion, and Darth Treya, who had been Kreia before the betrayal. The Order was nearly extinct. Most surviving Jedi Masters had gone into deep hiding. Nihilus was the worst of the three, a man who had also been present at Malachor 5, also been hit by the psychic shockwave, but instead of severing himself, had been consumed, becoming a void in the Force that devoured Force-sensitive life the way a black hole devours light. He fed on entire planets. She didn't stay in hiding like the surviving masters had. She moved, found each of the remaining masters, reconnected them to the living force, and brought them to Dantooine, where they could reconvene a council and decide the Order's future. That decision cost her more than she expected. The masters, when they finally gathered, told her that her wound in the Force was itself a threat, that she fed on the deaths of others unconsciously, that the Sith had learned their life-draining techniques from echoes of what she was. They wanted to close the wound by severing her from the Force permanently and completely, this time not by her own choice. Kreia killed them before they could, all 5 simultaneously, draining their Force connection as punishment for what she saw as the Order's final hypocrisy. The institution that had abandoned Meetra, using her one more time and then planning to discard her. Meetra was there and could not stop it, the council she had rebuilt, gone in seconds. What followed was the confrontation on Malachor itself. Kreia had retreated to the Treyos Academy, the ancient Sith training ground at the planet's broken core. Meetra fought through an entire academy of Sith assassins alone. She faced Darth Sion, a man whose body had been shattered in battle and who sustained himself through pure focused hatred, healing every wound by sheer refusal to die, and defeated him. She convinced him that the pain keeping him alive was worse than death, that letting go was the only freedom still available to him. He agreed and died, and it was one of the most compassionate things anyone in this series ever did for an enemy. Kreia's final conversation with Meetra is one of the strangest and most philosophically dense exchanges in Star Wars. A teacher who hated the Force, telling her student what she saw in the future, who would live, who would die, what the Force was actually doing with all of them. Meetra killed her, which was what Kreia had been steering toward the entire time. She wanted to die at the hands of someone she had genuinely taught, genuinely connected with. Her death was her final lesson. Meetra activated the mass shadow generator one last time on her way out, destroying what remained of Malachor permanently. The wound in the Force closed by destroying the place that had created it. She rebuilt, not the Order as it had been, something smaller, more honest, built from the broken people she'd gathered and healed along the way. Then she went looking for Revan, because the story he'd started in the unknown regions wasn't finished. She found him imprisoned on Drummond Cars, freed him, and the two of them faced the Sith Emperor together with Lord Scourge, who then stabbed her in the back. She became a Force ghost, stayed with Revan in his 3-century imprisonment, kept him sane, kept him connected to himself while the Emperor tried to consume him completely. The woman who had severed herself from the Force at Malachor spent 300 years as pure Force presence, sustaining the man who had trusted her with the nod that started all of this. The new Sith Wars started in 2000 BBY, 2,000 years of continuous conflict between the Jedi Order and successive Sith factions, grinding across the galaxy in waves, sometimes open warfare, sometimes cold standoffs, sometimes brutal insurgencies that burned worlds without any formal declaration. By the time Lord Hoth took command of the Army of Light around 1002 BBY, the Republic was exhausted in a way that goes beyond military exhaustion. It was civilizationally tired. Whole systems had changed hands multiple times. Economies had collapsed and rebuilt around the assumption of permanent conflict. Children grew up having never known peace as anything other than a rumor about the past. Hoth joined the Jedi Order with one specific dream: end the Sith threat himself. That kind of ambition in a Jedi is unusual, and the Council would normally have spent considerable energy redirecting it towards something more measured. But the new Sith Wars didn't leave much room for measured. They needed someone who wanted to win badly enough to do what winning actually required, and Hoth was that person. He rose to Battlemaster of the Coruscant Jedi Temple, the Order's top combat instructor, then Supreme Commander of the Republic military, which at this point wasn't a civilian appointment, but a role the Jedi held directly. The Order of this era looks nothing like the one Obi-Wan Kenobi belonged to. These were warrior lords, Jedi commanding armies in the field, lightsabers and military strategy completely intertwined. Hoth was the apex of that model. Blunt, direct, legendarily bad-tempered, and completely without patience for anything that slowed the mission down. Around 1002 BBY, he forged the bulk of the Jedi Order's fighting strength into the Army of Light, an independent military force operating separately from the Republic Navy. He'd spent the years before that driving the Brotherhood of Darkness, Lord Skira Khan's Sith faction, from world to world, chasing them off Hoth, off Droman Kaas, off Malrev 4. The planet Hoth, by the way, is named after him. The same frozen wasteland where the Rebel Alliance would hide their base 4,000 years later carries the name of the man who fought a battle there against the Sith. History has a sense of humour. The Ruusan campaign began in 1002 BBY and lasted 2 brutal years. 7 separate battles on one planet, each more grinding than the last, fought across Ruusan's forests and valleys and cave systems against the Brotherhood of Darkness and its full strength. The first battle was a complete disaster. Not a single Republic soldier escaped alive. The Army of Light recovered, pushed back, won 4 of the next 6 engagements. But the cost was enormous. The reinforcements were slow, and Hoth was fighting a war of attrition on a hostile planet with dwindling supplies and soldiers who had been in the field for months without adequate rest. He had a feud running simultaneously with his own side. Valentin Farfalla, a Jedi Lord who looked, by every account, like someone who had never experienced a single uncomfortable moment in his life. Golden ship, ornate armour, beautiful everything. A man who wore his identity openly and with visible pleasure in exactly the way Hoth found personally offensive. They clashed from their first meeting. Hoth thought Farfalla was performing Jedihood rather than living it, all aesthetics and no substance. Farfalla thought Hoth was a blunt instrument who confused grimness with seriousness. Their mutual friend Pernikar mediated between them, smoothed the edges enough that they could operate in the same campaign. Then Pernikar was killed in a Sith ambush during the campaign, and the relationship between Hoth and Farfalla collapsed completely. When Farfalla left Ruusan to find reinforcements, 300 fresh Jedi Knights, and Hoth's Army of Light was left depleted and pinned down, Hoth switched tactics out of necessity. He stopped fighting open battles he didn't have the numbers to win and moved to guerrilla warfare, using Ruusan's rainy season and its vast forest cover to keep his forces alive until help arrived. It worked, barely, at tremendous cost. Farfalla came back with those 300 Jedi and broke through the Sith blockade in orbit. Hoth still refused to speak to him. The war had killed his friend and his patience in roughly equal measure, and Farfalla's return, which should have been a relief, landed as a reminder of everything the campaign had taken. They reconciled eventually, because they had to. The alternative was letting the Brotherhood of Darkness win while 2 Jedi Lords sulked at each other across a campfire. The reconciliation wasn't warm. It was 2 professionals making a practical decision to stop letting their grief interfere with the mission. The 7th and final battle, in 1000 BBY, broke the Brotherhood's back. Farfalla's forces hit them hard in the field, while Hoth's troops drove their command structure into the caves at the Valley of the Jedi. Khan and his remaining Sith Lords retreated underground. The war was essentially won. And this is where Hoth made the decision that defines his entire story. He knew about the thought bomb, not as a rumour, as a certainty. A Sith Lord named Kopech had told Farfalla about it before dying in a duel with him, trading the information for a clean death rather than face what the bomb would do. The thought bomb was an ancient Sith weapon that combined the dark side energy of every Sith Lord participating in its creation into an explosion that killed every Force-sensitive being within its radius instantly, and trapped their souls in a vortex of dark side energy indefinitely. Not death in any clean sense, eternal imprisonment inside the Force itself. Hoth understood exactly what was coming. He ordered Farfalla to pull back with the majority of the Army of Light, get them out of the blast radius, preserve what could be preserved, and then he gathered 100 volunteers, fully informed, fully aware, and led them into the caves after Khan. Not to stop the bomb. He couldn't stop it. He went in because someone had to corner Khan badly enough that he'd actually use it. An unused thought bomb meant the Brotherhood survived and the war continued. Hoth's 100 were the pressure that made Khan's hand move. They were the mechanism by which the war ended, and they knew it going in, All 100 died in those caves at 1000 BBY, including Hoth. The thought bomb took their bodies and their souls, trapping them in the Valley of the Jedi alongside the Sith Lords they'd pursued. Hoth and Khan and hundreds of others locked together in a Force nexus beneath Ruusan's surface. They stayed there for over 1,000 years until Kyle Katarn freed them in 5 ABY, 4 years after the Battle of Yavin. Hoth waited in the dark for 1,000 years for someone to finally let him go. What followed his death was the Ruusan Reformation, and understanding it is essential to understanding every Jedi who comes after him in this series. The Republic and the Jedi Order, processing the end of a 2,000-year war, made sweeping institutional changes at 1000 BBY. The Jedi demilitarized completely. No more armies, no more Jedi Lords commanding fleets, no more warrior monks leading ground campaigns. They became peacekeepers, adjuncts to civil authority rather than military commanders. They gave up their independent forces and folded themselves into the Republic's structures as advisors and guardians rather than generals. The order that walked into the Ruusan Reformation looked like Hoth. The order that walked out looked like the one Obi-Wan Kenobi and Mace Windu belonged to. Those are not the same institution. The change was total, in structure, in philosophy, in what a Jedi was expected to be and do. Hoth's sacrifice made it possible, and the order his sacrifice produced would have been largely unrecognizable to him. His Padawan, Johun Othone, built a monument at the battlefield afterward. The Valley of the Jedi, where the thought bomb detonated, where 1,000 Force-sensitive souls were trapped in the ground, became a memorial. Johun spent the rest of his life there, maintaining it, refusing to leave. He'd watched his master walk into a cave, knowing he wasn't coming back, and the only response he could find was to stay close to the place where it happened. The most human possible reaction to an enormous loss. 232 BBY, 232 years before the Battle of Yavin. The Jedi Order is at its absolute peak, trusted by the Republic, present across the galaxy, respected in a way they haven't been since before the Ruusan Reformation. No Sith Empire looming on the horizon, no galactic war grinding everything down. Chancellor Lina So's Republic is expanding into the Outer Rim, building infrastructure, extending the hand of civilization into the frontier. And right at the center of all of it, the crown jewel of the entire era is Starlight Beacon, a massive space station positioned at the edge of known space, built at enormous expense to serve as a hub of culture, medicine, and Jedi presence for the worlds that had never had any of those things before. The Jedi the Council chose to run it was Avar Kriss, and the choice tells you everything about what the High Republic thought a Jedi should be. She was born around 262 BBY, trained as a Padawan under a master named Chirf Mauta, one of the Order's most celebrated seekers, a Jedi who specialized in finding Force sensitives across the galaxy and bringing them home. Avar grew up alongside Stellan Gios and Elzar Mann, the three of them inseparable through their training years, rising through the Order together. By the time they were masters, they were the emotional core of their entire generation, the people everyone else looked to when the galaxy got complicated. Her connection to the Force was genuinely unusual. Most Jedi described the Force as a presence, an energy, something felt. Avar heard it as music, not metaphorically. She described it literally as a song, with each Force-sensitive being a distinct voice in the choir. She could feel individual Jedi across vast distances through it, identify them by their specific frequency, reach through the Force, and conduct them the way a conductor shapes an orchestra. In moments of crisis, she could link entire groups of Jedi together through that musical connection, coordinating them into something more coherent and more powerful than any of them could have managed alone. The Great Disaster hit in 232 BBY, right at Starlight Beacon's dedication ceremony. The Legacy Run, a cargo ship carrying colonists through hyperspace, collided with a Nihil vessel using path engine technology, and the impact sent massive chunks of starship debris cascading through hyperspace lanes at lethal velocity. The Hetzel system was directly in the path of it. Thousands of ships, millions of people, an inhabited system about to be shredded by debris, traveling at hyperspace speeds, with no warning and no time to evacuate. Avar floated in the air in a meditative pose in front of the Republic crew and reached out through the Force to every Jedi in range. Linked them together through her musical connection, made them a single coordinated instrument, and pulled the disaster apart, piece by piece. Each Jedi felt what the others felt, moved where the gaps were, caught what the others couldn't reach. The Republic crew watching it happen described it as witnessing something genuinely unprecedented. She became the hero of Hetzel overnight. The Council immediately appointed her Marshal of Starlight Beacon, the most visible, most significant Jedi posting in the galaxy. She declined a seat on the Council to take it. That detail matters. The Council offered her the highest rank in the Order, and she said she'd rather be on the frontier doing the actual work. That's not humility performance. That's a woman who understood precisely what she was built for and wasn't interested in substituting prestige for purpose. The Nihil complicated everything. Space marauders operating out of the Outer Rim, led from the shadows by a man named Martian Rowe. The Nihil used path engines, technology that let their ships travel through hyperspace in ways the Republic considered physically impossible. They could appear anywhere, vanish before anyone could respond, hit without warning, and leave before defenses organized. The great disaster itself had been orchestrated by Rowe. The Legacy-run collision was caused by a Nihil ship, not an accident. The chaos that followed was intentional. Every great work Chancellor So had built, every symbol of Republic expansion and goodwill was a target. Avar led the response. That meant years of campaigns across the Outer Rim, chasing an enemy that didn't fight fair by design, losing people she cared about to an organization that kept revealing new depths to its capabilities every time she thought she'd understood it. Her obsession with a Tempest runner named Lorna D, one of the Nihil's top commanders, became a problem the Council had to address directly. She defied their orders to send Jedi undercover into Nihil territory to capture D. The Council relieved her of her marshal position as a result, handing command of Starlight to Stellan Gios while Avar went hunting on her own. The woman who had linked hundreds of Jedi together through pure Force harmony, the paragon the entire Order held up as their ideal, got ground down by a prolonged asymmetric war against an enemy she couldn't fully reach, and became obsessed to the point of insubordination. Because she was exactly who she was, and who she was cared so completely about protecting people, that when she kept failing to do it, the anger had nowhere to go except inward and then outward in the wrong direction. The Force's song, she said after Starlight fell, had a name in her head by the end. She said it was called Avar Kriss, meaning she heard it as failure, as her own name attached to everything that had gone wrong. Starlight Beacon fell in 230 BBY. Marchion-Ro's agents infiltrated the station during a wave of refugees fleeing Nihil attacks, used the chaos as cover, caused systemic failures throughout the station, and released a Nameless into the Jedi quarters. The Nameless were creatures that fed on Force sensitivity itself. In their presence, Jedi lost their connection to the Force entirely, felt only primal terror, were reduced to husks if exposed long enough. The station broke apart, fell out of orbit, crashed onto the planet Aram below. Stellan Gios died on it. Avar survived the crash and found Elzar Mann emerging from an escape pod, and their reunion, the two of them alive on a planet covered in wreckage after everything, was tearful in the way that only surviving something catastrophic together can produce. She blamed herself for Stellan's death completely. He was only on the station because she had been relieved of command. Her defiance of the Council had put him there. The fact that she hadn't caused the disaster, hadn't released the Nameless, hadn't built the Nihil's weapons, none of that moved the needle on the guilt. She had made a choice that put her best friend in harm's way, and he hadn't come back, and she was going to carry that for the rest of her life. Rowe then activated the Storm Wall, a barrier of hyperspace disrupting buoys, sealing off 10 full sectors of the Outer Rim as the Nihil occlusion zone. The Republic couldn't reach through it. Avar was already inside it when it went up, hunting the Nihil in their own territory, and suddenly she was trapped behind a wall that the entire Republic couldn't break. The Marshal of Starlight Beacon, the hero of Hetzel, the living ideal of what a Jedi should be, stranded alone in enemy space, cut off from everyone, with the galaxy watching the Nihil's flag fly over 10 sectors of the frontier she had dedicated her career to protecting. Her story past that point is still being told across the High Republic publishing line, but the arc up to the Storm Wall is complete enough to draw the line clearly. Avar Kriss is what the Jedi Order looked like at its best and at its most human simultaneously. She was the person they held up as the example, and she was also the person who got obsessed, who defied the Council, who heard her own name in the Force as the sound of failure. 200 years after her era, the Order she belonged to would produce a council so cautious, so procedural, so committed to not making the mistakes of passion that they'd miss Palpatine sitting in the same building. You can draw a straight line from the golden age she lived through to the paralysis that came after it. Institutions that survive catastrophe don't always survive it intact. Sometimes they survive it overcorrected. Avar Kriss got ground down. The High Republic got ground down with her. 896 BBY. That's when this story starts. To give you a sense of what that means, when Yoda was born, the Ruusan Reformation was still 100 years away. The Sith Rule of Two didn't exist yet. The temple on Coruscant that he would eventually spend 8 centuries walking through hadn't been built in its final form. He predates most of the institutions the prequel-era Jedi took for granted by centuries. When Mace Windu was born, Yoda was already over 800 years old. He wasn't just a wise old Jedi by the time of the Clone Wars. He was a living archive of everything the Order had ever been, and nobody actually knows who taught him. The rumour, treated as legend even within the Order itself, is that his first instructor was a Hysalrian Jedi Master named Nakata del Gormo. The story goes that a young Yoda, travelling with a human companion, crash-landed on an unidentified swamp planet. Del Gormo found them, sensed the Force in both of them, and trained them before a Republic ship eventually came to collect Yoda. Mace Windu kept a sand sculpture of the Hysalria system in Yoda's quarters in 32 BBY. Noticed it, remembered the rumour, said nothing. Yoda used the Force to reshape the sculpture into an Alderaanian rose and change the subject. That's the closest anyone ever got to confirming it, a sand sculpture and a subject change. Frank Oz, who voiced Yoda in the original films, said he believed Yoda spoke his unusual backwards way, specifically in honour of his master, that it was a stylistic tribute carried forward for 800 years. Whether that's true or not, it's one of the most quietly beautiful details in all of Star Wars. The most powerful Jedi alive, still talking funny because of how his first teacher spoke. By 796 BBY, when he was exactly 100 years old, Yoda had attained the rank of Jedi Master, which, for a species that lives to 900, is roughly the equivalent of achieving full mastery before you finish growing up. He spent the next 8 centuries doing one thing more than anything else: training people. Not just Padawans in the formal sense, though he had those too. He taught the youngling classes for hundreds of years, meaning that virtually every Jedi Knight who ever served in the prequel era had sat in a circle around Yoda as a child and heard his voice for the first time, asking them what they feared. Estimates put his total students across his lifetime at somewhere around 20,000. 20,000 Force sensitives shaped in some meaningful way by the same small green hands. His most famous Padawan, of course, was Dooku, and we'll get fully into Dooku's story next time, but the shape of their relationship matters here. Yoda trained the most talented student he ever had, loved him deeply, watched him leave the Order in grief and disillusionment, and then watched him become his enemy. That specific failure, not a stranger falling, but his own student, the one he'd known since childhood, sat with Yoda for decades before it resolved into anything like understanding. In 382 BBY, Yoda was involved in stopping the violence of the Night of Sorrow, a brutal conflict between the Jedi and an anti-Jedi cult called the Path of the Open Hand. He personally chose to preserve the nameless creatures the cult had used as weapons against Force sensitives rather than destroy them, sealing them away in a vault on Jedha. That decision, keep the weapon, understand it, don't pretend it doesn't exist, echoes Odan-Urr's logic with the Sith holocron. The Order's wisest members kept making the same call across centuries. Understanding a dangerous thing is safer than erasing it. The results, as we've seen, were mixed. Around 230 BBY, during Avar Kriss's era, a period Yoda was alive for, but operating at the edges of, the Jedi training ship Odan-Urr crashed on Dathomir. Yoda led the recovery mission. The Dathomiri witches refused to let the Jedi leave with everything, and Yoda made the pragmatic choice to leave behind some Jedi knowledge stored in the ship's data tapes, rather than escalate into open conflict over a planet that would only grow more hostile with every exchange. He told the Witch clan, who accepted the tapes, that a future Jedi would come to claim them when the time was right. 400 years later, during the Clone Wars, Ahsoka Tano retrieved them. Yoda kept his word across 4 centuries without writing it down or telling anyone. It was simply in his head, one of tens of thousands of unfinished threads he carried through an impossibly long life. By the time the prequel era began, 32 BBY, he had been Grand Master for centuries. The Council deferred to him on almost everything. He sat in that chair and listened to arguments about strategy and philosophy and the Force, and he had almost always seen the shape of the argument before, in some form, in some century. The patience that read on screen as wisdom was partly just the accumulation of having been through enough iterations of the same problems to know how they tended to resolve. He sensed the dark side, clearly, consistently, from the moment Darth Maul appeared on Tatooine in 32 BBY. He told the Council the shroud of the dark side had fallen, that he couldn't see clearly, that their ability to use the Force had been diminished in ways he couldn't fully diagnose. He said this openly, and then he and the Council kept operating anyway. Because what else do you do when your instrument of perception is compromised? You do your best with what you have, and you acknowledge the limitation. He acknowledged it. He just couldn't fix it. The Clone Wars began in 22 BBY. For 3 years he served as a general, Yoda on a battlefield, commanding clone troopers, fighting a war he'd spent his entire life trying to make unnecessary. He fought Dooku on Geonosis and on Coruscant. He won both duels. He couldn't bring himself to kill his former Padawan in either one. Whether that was mercy or failure or both is a question the Lord doesn't answer cleanly, because it isn't a clean question. Order 66 came in 19 BBY. The clones he'd fought alongside for 3 years turned on every Jedi simultaneously. Yoda was on Kashyyyk when it happened, felt every death through the Force. As it occurred, hundreds of Jedi cut down across the galaxy in minutes. He killed his own escort clones before they finished raising their weapons. He went to Coruscant and fought Palpatine in the Senate chamber. The most powerful Jedi alive against the most powerful Sith alive, in a room full of floating Senate pods with the fate of everything hanging over it. He lost. Not overwhelmed, he lost the duel in the technical sense, fell from a great height, was forced to retreat while Palpatine consolidated power above him. Bail Organa got him out in a pod. He left. Dagobah, 19 BBY. A swamp planet with a dark side nexus so dense it masked Force presences from Imperial detection, which was why he chose it practically. But the parallels to Nakata del Gormo's planet, the swamp where he'd first been found by his own master, almost certainly weren't lost on him. He built a hut out of tree roots and clay. He waited. For 22 years, he sat in a swamp and rethought everything. During that exile, Qui-Gon Jinn's spirit reached him. Qui-Gon, who had discovered the path to Force immortality before his death, who had been learning to transmit his consciousness across the barrier between living and cosmic Force, taught Yoda how to do the same, how to retain identity after death, how to become one with the Force and still speak, still reach, still guide. This is the achievement that mattered most in the long run. The fact that Yoda learned in exile, in a swamp, how to die correctly, and then passed that knowledge to Obi-Wan, who passed it to Luke, who passed it forward again. The chain of immortality, running from Qui-Gon through Yoda, through Obi-Wan, changed what the Jedi could be after death. It turned defeat into presence. Luke came in 3 ABY. Yoda didn't want to teach him. Told Obi-Wan's spirit the boy was reckless, too old, too full of his father. He was right about some of it. He taught him anyway, because Obi-Wan asked, and because Yoda could feel what Luke was underneath the impatience. He died in 4 ABY on that same planet, in that same hut, telling Luke there was another Skywalker, 900 years old, in a mud house he'd built himself, passing the last thing he knew to the last student he had. 102 BBY. A baby is born on Sereno into one of the wealthiest noble families in the galaxy. His father is Count Gora, cold, distant, a man who treats his children as political instruments rather than people. His mother dies young. His sister Genza, the one person in that household who actually loves him, watches him get taken by the Jedi Order as a toddler and doesn't see him again for decades. He grows up inside the temple on Coruscant, brilliant and increasingly aware that the family that gave him away still exists out there, carrying a title and a legacy that technically belongs to him. That wound, being surrendered, being given away before he was old enough to have an opinion about it, never fully healed. Most Jedi children arrive too young to remember anything before the Order. Dooku remembered enough, and remembering enough meant always having a version of himself that existed before the Jedi shaped him, a self that the Order didn't create and therefore couldn't fully contain. He trained under Yoda from 86 BBY, and their relationship, at least in the early years, was genuinely warm. Yoda saw in Dooku the most technically gifted student he'd ever trained, and Dooku admired Yoda with the specific intensity that exceptionally talented people reserve for the one teacher who can actually keep up with them. He accompanied Yoda on missions across the galaxy, kept a personal journal of their travels. The relationship was real. That's important because what happened to it later was not the collapse of a facade, it was the collapse of something genuine. His best friend through all of this was Sifo-Dyas. Their friendship matters here because it gives Dooku's early years a texture that the films never show. They grew up together in the temple, got in trouble together, studied dark side artifacts together out of pure intellectual curiosity long before either of them understood what that curiosity would eventually cost. They were the two brightest students of their generation, pulling each other forward. Sifo was the visionary, chaotic and prophetic. Dooku was the strategist, precise and relentless. Together they were extraordinary. By 68 BBY, Dooku was a Jedi Master. He took 2 Padawans, Rael Averross first, then Qui-Gon Jinn. Averross was difficult, emotionally unstable, in ways that required patience Dooku had to consciously develop. Qui-Gon was something else entirely. Independent, instinctive, focused on the living force in ways that occasionally frustrated his master, but that Dooku honestly respected. He shaped Qui-Gon's rebellious streak more than he suppressed it. Every teacher put something of themselves into their students, and what Dooku put into Qui-Gon was the conviction that the individual mattered more than the institution. That lesson would outlast them both. The disillusionment built slowly, across decades, through accumulated evidence that the Republic Dooku had served his entire adult life was rotting from the inside. Senate corruption wasn't a rumour or an opposition talking point. He'd watched it operate up close on too many diplomatic missions to pretend it wasn't structural. The Trade Federation had purchased enough votes to insulate itself from accountability. Corporate interests had their hands in every committee that mattered. The Jedi sat in their temple, dispatched to troubleshoot the symptoms, and never addressed the disease. Dooku raised these concerns in council meetings. He was heard respectfully, and nothing changed. He raised them again. Nothing changed. He raised them a third time, and was told essentially that the Order's role was to serve the Republic, not reform it. In 44 BBY, the Battle of Galidraan, a Mandalorian Death Watch faction had been framed by a corrupt governor for committing atrocities they hadn't actually committed. The Jedi Council, including Dooku, sent a strike team that massacred nearly the entire Mandalorian force. When the truth came out, the Council quietly acknowledged the error and moved on. No accountability, no public reckoning. The governor who had manipulated them faced no consequences. Dooku pushed for a formal investigation. The Council declined. That specific moment, the institutional refusal to examine its own failures, broke something in him that hadn't broken before. He met Palpatine in 42 BBY. Just a conversation, introduced through his former Padawan Rael Avaros. Palpatine was a Naboo senator at that point, publicly and privately the most dangerous man alive. He listened to Dooku talk about the Senate's corruption and the Jedi's complicity and said, "Yes, I agree with you. And isn't it extraordinary that someone with your clarity of vision has been contained within an institution that can't use it?" He didn't offer Dooku the dark side, he offered him validation, which, for a man who had spent decades being politely ignored by the Council, landed like water in a desert. 32 BBY, Qui-Gon died on Naboo. Darth Maul's blade through his chest, in a duel the Council hadn't believed was coming, despite Qui-Gon's explicit warnings about a Sith operative on Tatooine. Dooku stood in the temple and felt it through the Force. The specific extinguishing of the presence he'd trained and loved and watched become his finest work. He went to the Council and said Qui-Gon had warned them that the Sith were back, active, and his Padawan had died partly because the Council had treated the warning as an overreaction. The Council acknowledged the loss. Nothing changed. He killed Master Yaddle that same year. This is the detail most people don't know, and it's the one that draws the absolute line. Yaddle, a Council member, a genuinely wise and compassionate Jedi, had discovered that Dooku was already meeting with Darth Sidious. She confronted him alone, gave him every opportunity to step back from what he was doing, told him there was still a path back. He used the dark side to kill her and covered it up. That was the moment he stopped being a disillusioned Jedi and became something else. Yaddle's death was his first kill for the Sith, and he chose it with a clear head. He left the Order officially soon after, became one of the Lost 20, the 20 Jedi Masters in all of history who had voluntarily renounced their vows and departed. His bust joined the others in the Jedi archives, and Jocasta Nu noted when Obi-Wan came looking that it was a great loss to the Order. She wasn't wrong. He was brilliant, experienced, and his analysis of the Republic's failures was largely correct. The diagnosis was sound. The cure he'd chosen was catastrophic. He returned to Sereno, reclaimed the title of Count, and became Darth Tyrannus. Under that name, he orchestrated the murder of Sifo Dyas, his oldest friend, the man he'd grown up with. Because Sifo had commissioned the clone army, and Palpatine needed that army taken over, without witnesses who knew the full story. Dooku had Sifo killed by the Pike Syndicate on Oba-Diah, then went into the Jedi archives using Sifo's own authorization codes and erased Kamino from the star charts. He did it himself, personally, his best friend since childhood, dead, and Dooku cleaning up the evidence with his own hands. He then spent the next decade building the separatist movement, providing the galaxy's legitimate grievances with the Republic, a charismatic, credible, aristocratic face. And those grievances were real. The systems that joined the Confederacy of Independent Systems had actual reasons to feel abandoned by the Senate. Dooku wasn't manufacturing dissent from nothing. He was channeling genuine political frustration into a war that Palpatine needed to destabilize the Republic from both sides simultaneously. Dooku knew he was serving a larger plan. He believed he was one of the architects of that plan. He didn't know he was the distraction. The Clone Wars started in 22 BBY at Geonosis. Dooku fought Obi-Wan, fought Anakin, fought Yoda. And in the duel with Yoda, the two of them circled each other in a room full of Senate pods while the fate of everything hung overhead. Yoda matched him completely. Dooku threw a pillar at Obi-Wan and Anakin to force Yoda to choose between pursuing the fight and saving his friends. Yoda chose the friends. Dooku escaped. Whether Yoda could have ended it there if he'd let the others fall is a question neither of them ever answered out loud. 19 BBY, the Battle of Coruscant. Grievous had kidnapped Palpatine. The whole thing staged, every element arranged, and Anakin and Obi-Wan boarded the flagship to retrieve him. Dooku fought them both. He defeated Obi-Wan easily, knocked him unconscious. Anakin pushed past his own limits and disarmed Dooku. Literally, cut off both hands. Dooku knelt on the floor, defenseless, and looked at Palpatine. Who told Anakin to kill him? He understood in that moment. You can see it in how he dies in the novelization. The sudden, total clarity of a man who has just realized he was never the architect, he was the scaffolding. Palpatine had been building toward Anakin the entire time, and Dooku had spent a decade helping construct the path that led to his own kneeling on a starship floor, waiting for a young man's blade to end him. He died at 72 years old, the most talented Padawan Yoda ever trained, the man who was right about almost everything that mattered and wrong about the one thing that cost him his life. He told Palpatine that the Jedi blindly served a corrupt Senate. He never once examined whether he was blindly serving someone worse. Around 80 BBY, a boy born on Coruscant entered the Jedi Temple and began training. Nothing about his early years suggested he would become one of the most consequential figures in galactic history. He was nervous as a Padawan, genuinely anxious about failure, in a way that his master Dooku had to actively work around. He lacked confidence. He second-guessed himself in situations where other initiates moved without hesitation. Whatever Qui-Gon Jinn eventually became, he didn't arrive that way. He grew into it, slowly, over decades, through a specific set of losses that reshaped him from the inside out. The first loss was Xanatos, his first Padawan, a talented, charismatic young man from a wealthy family on Telos IV, whose father was the planetary governor. Qui-Gon trained him for years, invested in him deeply, and watched him fall. Not to the dark side in some abstract philosophical sense, Xanatos chose his father's political ambitions over the Order when it mattered, turned against Qui-Gon personally, and spent years afterward as a corporate saboteur and a persistent antagonist. He eventually committed suicide rather than surrender when Qui-Gon cornered him on Telos. The scar that left on Qui-Gon was specific. He became deeply reluctant to train anyone again. The Council essentially had to push Obi-Wan Kenobi on him. The second loss was Pall, a fellow Jedi Master, his closest friend, and in the final years of her life, something considerably more than that. She was captured, tortured, and killed during a mission on New Absalom, around 44 BBY. Qui-Gon felt her die through the Force while he was still trying to reach her, and the grief that followed nearly broke him. He came closer to the dark side in the weeks after Pall's death than in any other moment of his life. Rage at the people responsible, rage at his own failure to get there in time. He pulled back, chose the light deliberately, consciously, in the way you only choose something when refusing it has become genuinely tempting. But Pall's absence was a shape in his life from that point forward, an empty space the Force filled with something quieter and more watchful than the man he'd been before. What emerged from those two losses was the Qui-Gon most people recognize, unhurried, deeply present in each moment, focused on the living Force, the immediate, particular, right in front of you expression of it, rather than the grand cosmic patterns the unifying Force theorists studied. He had a habit of finding strays. Jar Jar Binks, Boss Nass's exiled outcast, got his protection on Naboo. Anakin Skywalker, a slave child on Tatooine, got his freedom. His Padawan Obi-Wan, who'd nearly been passed over by the Order entirely, got his chance because Qui-Gon saw something in him at the 11th hour. The Council found this tendency maddening. Qui-Gon found their irritation baffling. The Force put people in front of you for reasons. Ignoring them in favor of procedure was to him a failure of the most fundamental Jedi responsibility. He was offered a seat on the Jedi Council multiple times. He declined every time. The Council operated from the cosmic Force perspective, from patterns and prophecy and long strategic arcs. Qui-Gon operated from the living moment. Those two orientations weren't compatible in the same chair, and he knew it. His relationship with the Council was cordial and permanently strained. They respected his abilities and found his independence exhausting. He respected their wisdom and found their caution increasingly inadequate as the galaxy's problems got more specific and more urgent. Around 44 BBY, he spent a full year on Mandalore with Obi-Wan, protecting Duchess Satin Kriss from Death Watch assassination attempts. A year hiding in safe houses, running across rooftops, keeping a young political leader alive through an insurgency. Obi-Wan fell in love with Satine during that year, and Qui-Gon, who had loved Pall and understood exactly what that cost, said nothing and pretended not to notice. He gave his Padawan the space to feel it and find his own way through it. That particular grace, knowing when not to intervene, is underrated in discussions of what made him an exceptional teacher. 32 BBY, the Trade Federation blockade of Naboo. He and Obi-Wan were sent to negotiate, walked into an assassination attempt, grabbed Queen Amidala, and ran. The hyperdrive took damage and forced them down on Tatooine for repairs, which is where the Force put a 9-year-old slave named Anakin Skywalker directly in his path. He felt the Force moving through the boy the way it moves through a place of enormous power. Anakin wasn't Force sensitive the way other Jedi were Force sensitive. He was something the Force was actively doing. The blood test came back with a midi-chlorian count over 20,000. Higher than Yoda, higher than anyone ever recorded in galactic history. Qui-Gon understood immediately and completely what he was looking at. The prophecy of the Chosen One. The being who would bring balance to the Force wasn't abstract scripture anymore. It was a child in a slave's tunic who built a protocol droid in his spare time and smiled at strangers. He won Anakin's freedom from Watto in a bet on the Boon to Eve pod race. He left Anakin's mother behind on Tatooine deliberately because he had no other leverage and no other options, and he told Anakin this directly rather than softening it. Anakin said goodbye to his mother, knowing it was probably forever, and Qui-Gon watched it happen and let it happen because the Force was asking something of this boy that didn't allow for comfortable exits. The Council said no. Too old, too much fear, too attached. Qui-Gon heard them out and told them he would train Anakin himself, regardless of their ruling. He had already told Obi-Wan he was ready for knighthood specifically to clear the path. One Padawan at a time was the rule, and he intended to take Anakin as the next one. The Council said the matter would be revisited. Qui-Gon treated that as a yes. Then they went back to Naboo, and Darth Maul was waiting. The duel in the Theed power generator is one of the most precisely constructed fights in Star Wars. Maul was younger, faster, more aggressive. Qui-Gon fought Ataru, the most acrobatic and offensive of the lightsaber forms, which suited his physicality but left him exposed to the kind of relentless pressure Maul applied. The generator room separated Qui-Gon from Obi-Wan behind an energy barrier, and Maul was patient enough to wait for that moment. Alone, slightly winded, facing an opponent who had been trained by Palpatine himself for exactly this kind of killing, Qui-Gon was outmatched in those final seconds. Maul's blade went through his midsection. He knelt on the floor and waited for Obi-Wan to get through the barrier. He had seconds, and he used them to say one thing: the boy. Train the boy. And then he asked Obi-Wan to promise it. That dying request is the pivot point of the entire Skywalker saga. 72 BBY. A baby is orphaned on Harun Kal before he's old enough to remember it. His parents killed by a Vixus, a massive jungle predator, leaving him to be raised communally by the Gush Windu, the Koronai tribe he was born into. Force-sensitive humans indigenous to a planet so hostile that surviving it is an accomplishment before you've done anything else. The Jedi found him at 6 months old and brought him to Coruscant. That origin matters more than it sounds. Most Jedi initiates arrived from stable homes on safe worlds. Mace came from a place where the environment itself was actively trying to kill everything in it. The coldness that would later read as severity in council chambers wasn't something the Order installed in him. It arrived preloaded. He trained under Master Sislin Meyer, earned the rank of Jedi Master at 28, extraordinarily young. The kind of early promotion that tells you the council recognized something it didn't want to leave sitting idle, and took a council seat before most of his peers had finished their first solo assignments. He took Depa Billaba as his Padawan, trained her into one of the finest Jedi of her generation, and watched her break on Harun Kal during a Clone Wars guerrilla campaign, the planet that made him eventually consuming the student he'd sent there. That specific failure sat with him differently than most losses. He'd built her. He felt responsible for the cracks. His two defining abilities were Shatterpoint and Varpad, and understanding either one requires understanding that Mace Windu was not a man who suppressed his darkness. He was a man who had looked at it directly and decided to use it instead of pretending it wasn't there. Shatterpoint first, a rare force perception that let him see fault lines, in structures, in battle formations, in people. Not what was in front of him, but what everything in front of him was about to become. The exact node in a complex situation that struck at precisely the right moment collapses the whole thing. It sounds clinical. In practice, it was more like carrying a second pair of eyes that never turned off, that saw the hidden architecture of every situation in terms of where it was going to break. He could look at Count Dooku and immediately understand that removing him would fracture the entire Separatist command structure. He could look at Anakin Skywalker and see fault lines that nobody else on the council was willing to name out loud. Varpad is the darker one. He developed it alongside Master Sora Bulk, the 7th lightsaber form, a refinement of Juyo, and the most dangerous combat style in the Order's history. Where every other form kept the dark side at arm's length, Varpad walked directly toward it. The practitioner channeled their own darkness, the aggression, the thrill of combat, the pull toward violence, and redirected it through a controlled loop back into their fighting. You became a superconductor for both your own shadow and your enemies, feeding on their dark side energy and returning it amplified. Sora Bulk eventually fell trying to practice it. Depa Billaba broke under it. Mace was the only person in galactic history who used it his entire career and never fell, because only Mace had done the specific internal work required to run that current without being burned by it. He never trusted Anakin. From the moment the boy walked into the council chambers in 32 BBY, Shatterpoint was running and the fault lines were visible and enormous. He voted against training him, was overruled, spent the next 13 years watching the cracks widen exactly as he'd seen they would. When he denied Anakin the rank of Jedi Master in 19 BBY, assigning him to the council as Palpatine's representative. Without the title, it was politically clumsy, and he knew it, and he did it anyway, because the alternative was handing formal institutional authority to the structural vulnerability he'd been watching develop since the boy was 9 years old. 19 BBY, Anakin came to him with the information that Palpatine was Darth Sidious. Mace made one decision immediately. He didn't bring Anakin with him. Took Kit Fisto, Saisi Teen, and Aegon Kola, 3 excellent masters, and went to arrest the Chancellor without the one person whose Shatterpoint he could read most clearly. Whether that was tactical or instinctual, whether he was protecting Anakin from Palpatine or protecting the mission from Anakin, he couldn't have said himself with certainty. Palpatine killed all 3 supporting masters in seconds. George Lucas confirmed this explicitly. Sidious did not throw the fight. Varpad running at full intensity, channeling the most powerful dark side practitioner in millennia. Back against himself, Mace Windu disarmed and cornered Darth Sidious, the most dangerous man alive, on his knees. He used Shatterpoint in that moment, traced the circuit of dark power back to its source, feeling for the fault line, and found it, astonishingly, in Anakin Skywalker. Palpatine's Shatterpoint, the absolute Shatterpoint of the Sith. The dark side's entire architecture rested on one man standing frozen in a doorway. Mace understood in that instant that the duel was already over, that the real battle was the one he couldn't win with a lightsaber. He told Anakin to take Palpatine, that it was his destiny. He was right. It was the wrong delivery at the worst possible moment to a man already past his breaking point. Anakin severed his weapon hand. Sidious's lightning hit him before he could recover. Mace Windu went out a Senate office window at terminal velocity, 19 BBY, and the Empire rose while he was falling. In Legends, he survived, broke his fall through the Force, badly injured, went to ground in the Outer Rim, came back to Coruscant the following year to recover his lightsaber. Canon leaves him dead. Samuel L. Jackson has been publicly campaigning for his return for 20 years, which is its own kind of testament to what the character meant. Here's what doesn't change regardless of which version you believe. Mace Windu was the only Jedi who could have cornered Palpatine. He was also, by a specific sequence of events he couldn't have fully prevented, the Jedi least able to survive the specific moment cornering Palpatine required. Varpad needed dark side energy to be most effective. Palpatine needed Anakin to see a Jedi with a blade raised over a kneeling old man. The trap was built from Mace's greatest strength and the galaxy's most specific vulnerability, assembled at the same place and time. He saw fault lines in everything. He couldn't see the one where his certainty and Anakin's fear met in the same room. The hardest Jedi in the Order, undone not by a stronger opponent, by a perfect situation. 57 BBY. A boy is born on Stujun, a planet so unremarkable that when George Lucas was once asked where Obi-Wan came from, he made the name up on the spot during a live interview, and it stuck permanently in the canon. Nobody remembers Stujun. The galaxy remembers what Stujun produced. He was not a natural. That detail gets lost in the mythology built around him, but it's in the earliest records clearly. Obi-Wan Kenobi was not considered exceptionally gifted in the Force as a child. He was disciplined, he was committed. He worked harder than almost everyone around him, which is its own kind of talent, but a different kind than Anakin's raw power, or Dooku's effortless brilliance. He trained under Yoda as an initiate, was nearly passed over for Padawan assignment entirely, and ended up with Qui-Gon Jinn around 44 BBY under circumstances that had more to do with Qui-Gon's peculiar instincts than with any official recognition of Obi-Wan's potential. The early years of that partnership were genuinely difficult. Qui-Gon was unconventional, frequently ignored council direction, and operated on a wavelength that his new Padawan found consistently confusing. Obi-Wan was a rule follower by temperament, someone who found security in structure, and his master kept dismantling that structure in favor of whatever the living force was saying right now. They clashed constantly on missions. They also, slowly, over years of proximity and crisis, and the particular intimacy of a master-Padawan bond, became something closer than either of them fully admitted out loud. He lost someone else before Qui-Gon, Siri Tachi, a fellow Jedi Knight, a woman he'd known since the Temple, whose feelings for him and his for her were never resolved, because both of them chose the Order every time the choice arrived. She died in 22 BBY, caught by a vibroblade during a mission, and Obi-Wan held her while she went. He had loved her in the only way the Jedi Code permitted, quietly, at the edge of acknowledgement, never crossing the line that would have required a decision. Her death was the permanent answer to a question he'd spent years not quite asking. 32 BBY, Naboo. Qui-Gon died in the Theed power generator, and Obi-Wan killed the Sith who killed him, becoming the first Jedi to defeat a Sith Lord in combat in nearly 1,000 years, since the Ruusan Reformation. He stood over his master's body and made a promise he spent the next 13 years trying to keep. He took Anakin Skywalker as his Padawan. He was 25 years old, freshly knighted, and the boy had been handed to him by a dying man who'd believed in him completely. He honoured it the only way he knew how, by giving everything. His lightsaber form was Soresu, the most defensive style in the Order, Form 3, built entirely around deflection and survival. A man whose entire approach to conflict was to be impossible to destroy and wait for his opponent to exhaust themselves against him. He fought Grievous, he fought Maul twice, he fought Anakin. He never once led with the desire to kill. He led with the absolute refusal to be beaten. The Clone Wars from 22 to 19 BBY gave him the nickname the Negotiator, which is either the most ironic nickname in galactic history for someone who spent 3 years fighting a war, or the most accurate description of his actual approach to every situation, including combat. He commanded the 212th Attack Battalion, led campaigns across Utapau, Geonosis, Ryloth, 100 other worlds. He watched Anakin take Ahsoka as a Padawan and privately approved, recognizing in the choice something of Qui-Gon's same instinct for seeing people others overlooked. 19 BBY, Mustafar. He followed Padme there because he'd already seen the security footage from the Temple, already knew what Anakin had done, already understood that the man he'd trained for 13 years was gone. He didn't go to Mustafar to fight. He went because Padme was going, and because abandoning people had never been something he was capable of, even when following them led directly to the worst moment of his life. He won the duel, left Anakin on a volcanic riverbank burning, and took his lightsaber and walked away without finishing it, which some have called mercy and others have called the cruelest thing he ever did, and which was probably both simultaneously. 19 years on Tatooine, he arrived in 19 BBY and didn't leave meaningfully until 0 BBY. He built a hut in the desert, took the name Ben, worked a processing station for spare credits, and watched Luke Skywalker grow up from a careful distance, close enough to intervene if necessary, far enough that Owen Lars, who despised him, couldn't accuse him of interfering. In 2 BBY, Maul found him, came to Tatooine with Ezra Bridger in tow, using the boy as bait, wanting the final accounting that had been building since the duel on Naboo 30 years earlier. The fight lasted 3 strikes. Obi-Wan read Maul's form, recognized the exact attack pattern from the duel where Qui-Gon had died, stepped into it, and ended it completely. Present at the death of another person who had defined his life, providing the only comfort available. Maul asked if he was protecting the Chosen One. Obi-Wan said yes. Maul said then he would avenge them. It was the most human exchange either of them ever had. 0 BBY. Luke found him. He stepped back into the galaxy as Ben Kenobi for the last time guided the boy to Mos Eisley, got on the Falcon, walked onto the Death Star, and found Vader waiting at the end of a corridor. He'd known it was coming, had felt it in the Force before they docked. He looked past Vader at Luke, made sure the boy was watching, and lowered his blade. Became one with the Force at 57 years old, which for a Jedi is young, and which was entirely intentional. 41 BBY. A child is born on Tatooine with no father. The Force itself, through the midi-chlorians, produced a human being with a connection to it, so total that his blood count exceeded 20,000. Higher than Yoda, higher than anyone ever recorded. The galaxy had been building toward this for 36,000 years. Every name in this series, every fall and redemption and schism and war, every Jedi Master on a rain-soaked planet, and every Sith Lord dying in a dark tomb, all of it was pointed somehow at this child on a slave world who built droids in his spare time and had never heard the word Jedi. When Qui-Gon found him in 32 BBY, Anakin was 9 years old and already one of the best pod racers on Tatooine, already building things that shouldn't have been possible for a child without formal training, already using the Force constantly without knowing that's what he was doing. What Qui-Gon felt when he met him, it was recognition. The Force had made a person and sent him here, and this was the person. The Jedi Order took him in and immediately began failing him. The Order's entire philosophy was built around children who arrived young enough to be shaped before their attachments formed. Anakin arrived at 9 with a mother he loved completely, with memories of slavery and poverty and survival that 9-year-old Jedi initiates didn't have, with wounds already in him that the code had no framework for addressing. Yoda sensed the fear immediately. He spent 13 years being the most powerful Jedi in the Order and the least understood one. His friendship with Palpatine, the "I see your potential, and I'm not afraid of it," filled the specific gap the Order had left. Padme was the other element. Anakin loved her, and the love was real. They married in secret. The shame of the secret was worse than the secret itself. And Palpatine, who knew about all of it, never mentioned the shame. The vision of Padme dying in childbirth started in 19 BBY, and this is the exact mechanism of everything that followed. A man whose defining psychological wound was the fear of loss, watching his worst fear approach in slow motion and being told there was exactly one possible solution. Palpatine offered the ability to stop someone from dying, and Anakin, who had watched his mother die in his arms 3 years earlier, who had spent his entire adult life loving someone he couldn't protect within the rules of the institution that defined him, made the calculation that fear makes when it's backed into a corner. He chose the thing that might save her over the thing that was certain to lose her. He became Darth Vader in a Senate office on Coruscant at 19 years old in 19 BBY. And then he lost Padme anyway. She died in childbirth while he was already encased in black armor on a medical table, more machine than man, sustained by a suit that kept him alive and a hatred that gave him a reason to stay that way. Everything he had sacrificed everything to prevent happened regardless. The armor locked around a man who had already lost the thing he'd put the armor on to protect. He spent the next 23 years being the Empire's right hand, hunting Jedi, destroying what he'd once been part of, and underneath the armor, in whatever was left of Anakin Skywalker inside Darth Vader, something didn't die. It stayed there, diminished and buried, and occasionally surfacing in moments nobody was supposed to see. A flicker when Ahsoka's voice reached him through a comm unit, a pause on a battlefield that had no tactical explanation, the specific way he kept Luke alive when the Emperor ordered him killed. 4 ABY, his son found him. Luke Skywalker stood in front of the most feared man in the galaxy and said, "I know you're still in there." And Vader, who had spent 23 years making that idea impossible to defend, couldn't find an argument against a person who refused to stop believing it. When Palpatine tried to kill Luke on the second Death Star, Anakin Skywalker picked up the Emperor and threw him into the reactor core. Mortally wounded, electrocuted through the suit that kept him alive, he asked his son to take the mask off. He wanted to see him with his own eyes. With his own eyes. He died as Anakin Skywalker, looking at his son, 35 seconds after officially coming back to himself. Luke was born the same night his father fell, 19 BBY, on a medical station, while Padme died and Anakin became Vader. He was taken to Tatooine, the least likely planet in the galaxy for Darth Vader to ever look, hiding in plain sight on his father's childhood homeworld. Owen and Beru Lars raised him as a moisture farmer and kept him ignorant of everything, which was its own kind of protection and its own kind of wound. He grew up staring at twin sunsets with the specific restlessness of someone who knows they're supposed to be somewhere else and doesn't know where. He found out in 0 BBY when R2-D2 wandered off and Ben Kenobi came out of the desert and handed him a lightsaber that had belonged to his father, and the galaxy cracked open. His training was never finished. Obi-Wan died on the Death Star before he was done. Yoda died on Dagobah before Luke felt ready. He had to invent the rest himself, which meant he was simultaneously the last Jedi and the first of whatever came next, making decisions about the Force without a template, carrying a lineage that had just suffered the worst catastrophe in its history and needed to be rebuilt from almost nothing. His greatest act in the original trilogy was in 4 ABY on the second Death Star, refusing to kill his father when he had every reason to, when the Emperor was sitting 6 feet away telling him to, when the rebellion's survival might have been easier if he'd just done it. He threw the lightsaber down, said he was a Jedi, like his father before him. The act of faith in a man who had done everything possible to make faith impossible. That's what brought Anakin back. Luke didn't defeat the Sith. He refused to become one, and that refusal was enough. He spent the years after Endor rebuilding, travelled with R2 looking for lost Jedi lore, trained students wherever he found them, eventually built a temple and an academy, and started the work of restoring what Order 66 had destroyed. By 15 ABY he had taken his nephew, Ben Solo, Leia's son, Han Solo's boy, carrying Skywalker blood and Vader's shadow both, and was trying to give him what the old order had failed to give Anakin. Balance, presence, someone who saw him clearly and didn't look away. In 28 ABY, he looked into Ben Solo's mind in the dark and saw Snoke's corruption, saw what was coming, saw the destruction that was already half built, and for the briefest moment he ignited his lightsaber. Ben woke up, saw it, and felt what Anakin had felt, the institution choosing its own protection over its student's life. Luke realized what he'd done in the same second. He hadn't killed anyone. He'd lost everything anyway. Ben brought the temple down, took the surviving students, and became Kylo Ren. Luke went to Ahch-To and stayed there, the first Jedi temple, the birthplace of the Order. He went to the beginning and sat down and waited to die, because he was unsure whether the Jedi should continue at all. The most powerful Jedi alive, hiding from himself on a cliff above the ocean, milking alien creatures and reading ancient texts, and refusing to engage with a galaxy that kept sending him messages. Rey found him in 34 ABY. He resisted everything she asked. He told her the Jedi had been arrogant, had failed, had allowed the dark side to operate inside their own ranks for decades without seeing it. He wasn't wrong. He was also using truth as a reason to stay still, and Yoda showed as a Force ghost and burned the ancient tree and told him that failure was the greatest teacher there was, and that the next generation didn't need him to be perfect. They needed him to show up. He showed up at Crate. He sat in meditation on Ahch-To and projected himself across the galaxy, appearing on a salt-flat battlefield between the First Order's entire army and a dozen surviving Resistance fighters. The projection was perfect. He bought them the time they needed to escape. Kylo Ren slashed through the projection and found nothing. Luke, on Ahch-To, sat in the twin sunset's last light and let go. He was 53 years old. He became one with the Force, the way Obi-Wan had, the way Qui-Gon had taught it. He appeared to Rey on Ahch-To afterward as a Force ghost, appeared to Leia, appeared at the Battle of Exegol as a voice among 100 voices reaching Rey across the cosmic force, all the Jedi who had ever lived, present for the last moment, giving everything they had left to the woman carrying the lineage forward.